Chapter 227. The diplomatic mission of the Kingdom of Qing had quietened down, and now it was the turn of the other powers to be anxious. Shopkeeper Shang often came to deliver wine, and humbly conveyed the greetings of Xinjiang. Shen Zhong had also invited Fan Xian a few times, but Fan Xian found an excellent excuse to decline. Shen Zhong had no way of getting angry. On the contrary, Chong Ningho felt his heart ache at the loss of a fat piece of meat that had been at the tip of his tongue. Perhaps there was some agreement between the eldest princess and Shang Shanhu, but Xinjiang did not have a deep foundation in northern Qi. They still needed the help of the Overwatch Council. After Fan Xian's persuasion, Yan Bingyun finally agreed to his plan. He was prepared to use the network he had been building over the past 4 years. The news from the south seemed to show that the Qing court was as stable as Mount Tai, without a single ripple. However, the Overwatch Council's report mentioned that there had recently been a few strange murders on Shandong Road. Although the murderers had killed ordinary people, their methods were extremely cruel. This was a case of the Ministry of Justice, but it had never been solved, so the 4th Bureau of the Overwatch Council had taken over. Fan Xian did not pay much attention to this murder case, and Yan Bingyun did not pay attention either. After all, the matter in Shangjing was enough of a headache, and the two of them were planning something sinister. Fan Xian's reason for declining all the invitations was very good. For the past 2 days, he had often been chatting with a village girl. Given her status, neither Shen Zhong nor Chong Ningho had the guts to steal guests from her. In a quiet alley in Shangjing, a man and a woman were strolling and chatting. Their words floated lightly, disturbing the butterflies that were nesting in the flowers. Nature is heaven and earth, and man is heaven and earth. The so-called unity of heaven and man means that human affairs must follow the natural path of heaven and earth. Only then can the two be harmonious. Harmony is only a facade. What do you think is the unity of heaven and man, and the connection between heaven and man? Oh, I'm not sure about that. I just think that man follows the earth follows the heavens, heaven follows the Tao, and the Tao follows nature. Only then can there be harmony. Or harmony. Harmony is the highest. Master Fan, what you have said today is completely unconventional. I am truly impressed. Although she said she admired him, Haitang still put her hands in her pockets and dragged her feet. Her expression was serene as she walked on the street like a lazy woman. There was not a trace of admiration on her face. Fan Xian rubbed his nose in self-mockery. Just like that day in the palace, he imitated Haitang's sweeping footwork. Fortunately, this street was relatively quiet. Otherwise, if the two of them were to walk like this, they would probably be laughed to death by bystanders. Seeming to guess what he was thinking, Haitang said, I just feel comfortable walking like this. As for what other people think, I really don't care. Fan Xian thought about it for a moment and realized that it was quite true. People loved ease and hated work. Walking like this was indeed more comfortable than walking with one's head held high. The problem was, if one was really lazy, why not lie down in bed? As he thought this, his mouth naturally said, I still feel that lying on the bed is more comfortable. If Miss Haitang is willing, we can lie on the bed and talk about literature, talk about life. Haitang glanced at him. Fan Xian smiled a little embarrassedly and did not explain anything. He really did not have many romantic thoughts about Haitang, but for some reason, chatting with her always made him feel very relaxed. After his rebirth, Fan Xian had always wanted to experience many interesting things and meet many interesting people. This visit to northern Qi was largely to satisfy this spiritual need of his. Although there had been assassination plots along the way, and things had not been very interesting, Fan Xian had gotten to know 2 interesting people, Yan Bingyun and Haitang. Fan Xian felt that it had been worth it. I heard that Master Fan met with Master Xinjiang a few days ago? Haitang asked softly, reaching out to pull out the green branches hanging down from the street. It was already summer, but it had been raining heavily a few days ago, so there was no heat. The trees and flowers were still in the spirit of spring. Fan Xian nodded. We parted on bad terms. He knew that although he was above the court, he could see that the power of his faction was still biased towards the Empress Dowager, so he guessed why Haitang had asked this. Parted on bad terms? Haitang smiled, her face gentle. I am just curious. Master Fan, why did you hurriedly throw out that proposal? Were you not afraid that it would affect your reputation as an official if it got back to the south? Fan Xian's heart trembled, but his face showed no expression. I do not understand what you are talking about. Haitang said, the Empress Dowager was very tempted by your proposal. Fan Xian's face darkened slightly. Miss Haitang, you should know that these days, I have been in seclusion, refusing guests. The reason why I came out to accompany you when you spoke was because I felt that although you had acted against me at Wudu, you are, after all, an unworldly master. You would not talk about these petty matters of the world. Miss Haitang, you have disappointed me. If I did not say these things, I am afraid you would be even more disappointed, Master Fan. Haitang's mind was clear, and she would not be fooled by Fan Xian's flowery words. The Empress Dowager invites you into the palace. Fan Xian chuckled and cupped his hands in salute. Thank you for your trouble, Miss Haitang. Earlier, Master Fan, you said that sincerity is the way of heaven, and sincerity is the way of man. Haitang's bright jewel-like eyes looked at Fan Xian in a trance. Since you know the way, why not? Isn't it easier to deal with people with sincerity? Fan Xian took a deep breath and slowly circulated the strange tyrannical Xueqi in his body, resisting the pressure coming from Haitang. He smiled. Dealing with people with sincerity can be divided into big and small. Sincerity to people is a small way, and sincerity to the world is a great way. Miss Haitang, if you treat people with sincerity, why don't you tell me what secret Xiaoen has that even an unworldly master like your master is tempted? Sincerity to the world. Haitang's lips curled up slightly. My master is sincerity to the world, so I cannot say much. But the secret in Xiaoen's heart has kept him alive for 20 years. If that secret were to spread among the common people, I fear that the world would be in chaos for 20 years. Fan Xian was startled. He knew something that no one else knew. Based on what Haitang had said, could it be that there was some danger in the temple? The two of them returned to the path of idle conversation, and it was nothing more than a discussion of philosophy and theology. In any case, Fan Xian had a foundation in the history of Chinese philosophy from his previous life. He randomly picked out a few of Dong, Lu, and Wang's theories, and Haitang was greatly surprised. But many years later, Haitang slowly reflected on it and began to organize the theories of the great scholar Fan. Only then did she realize that the young man had said nothing. For some reason, in the late spring and early summer of northern Qi's Shangjing, the rain was so plentiful. Before, the warm spring sun had shone brightly, but now a chilly breeze blew, and raindrops fell through the branches above their heads. With a crash, Fan Xian opened the cloth umbrella at his side and held it over Haitang's head. Under normal circumstances, given Fan Xian's status, when he went out in the rain, his subordinates would hold the umbrella. But right now, it was just the two of them, and purely in terms of status, it was only right and proper for him to hold the umbrella for Haitang. The rain gradually soaked the street. Fan Xian looked calmly at the people on the street hiding from the rain, but in reality, he was carefully watching Haitang's steps. At this time, the feet of the two of them were covered in water. Fan Xian had long since stopped using the country girl's walk, intending to see how Haitang would walk. Haitang continued to walk. Fan Xian shrugged his shoulders helplessly. Only now did he realize that although Haitang's feet were dragging on the water, there seemed to be some kind of invisible power under her shoes, supporting her whole body. The soles of her shoes were not touching the water at all. This kind of skill, Fan Xian thought, was not at a level he could reach. He couldn't help but laugh at himself. Haitang floats on water. Haitang ignored him and continued to walk. Fan Xian sighed. I don't believe that you can walk comfortably like that. I don't like that man called Yan Bingyun, Haitang suddenly said. I think that Miss Haitang has always lived deep in the mountain palace. You shouldn't have had any contact with a great scholar of the Qing kingdom. Using deceiving women to obtain his own benefits, Haitang is quite shameless. We are officials, not ordinary people, Fan Xian said on Yan Bingyun's behalf. He didn't want Yan Bingyun to be remembered by a 9th-level master for the rest of his life. For the good of the kingdom of Qing, there are some things that we must do. Haitang said, ugliness is ugliness. Don't use being an official as a cover. Fan Xian smiled. Although being emotionless may not necessarily be a true hero, if one's heart is too soft, how can one survive in this chaotic world? Master Fan, do you believe that today's world is chaotic? The minds of the people are confused. Master Fan, do you believe that only chaotic times can produce heroes? I do not seek to establish myself as a hero. I only seek to be a man with a clear conscience. The two of them talked and stopped. They had already reached the outskirts of a small temple. At that moment, the rain had coincidentally stopped. This place was far away on the outskirts of the capital. It was very quiet, without a trace of human presence. A leaf fell on the stone steps in front of the temple. The temple door was slowly pushed open. Fan Xian looked at the woman sitting by the incense table in the temple. After a moment of absent-mindedness, he bowed. Miss C, long time no see. The corners of Haitong's lips curled up. Master Fan, you want to be a man. I did not expect that as I expected. You are a man who has tender protective feelings for the fairer sex. With a swish, Fan Xian gathered up his wet umbrella and looked at Sea Lily, who had risen to greet him. He smiled. Being emotionless may not necessarily be a true hero. How can a man who has tender feelings for the fairer sex not be a man? Chapter 228. A heartless man is not necessarily a true hero. How can a compassionate son not be a true man? Haitang repeated slowly. Her face returned to her usual smile, and she led Fan Xian through the wooden door of the little temple. Master Fan. Sea Lily curtsied. Fan Xian, with a warm and distant smile, cupped his hands in greeting. When did you enter Shangjing, Miss C? Thanks to your good fortune, I entered the capital 3 days ago. I had a safe journey. Thank you for your concern. Sea Lily slowly lowered her eyelids. She was still wearing the light green robe she had worn during the journey. The weather was hot, and she was not afraid of catching a cold. Fan Xian quietly said a few more words to her. Haitang watched calmly from the side, but there was a glimmer of a smile in her eyes. How could the unfamiliar expressions on their faces escape her eyes? Fan Xian felt a little strange. Why had Haitang brought him to the temple where Sea Lily was staying? And where were the palace nannies who had always served Sea Lily? Did Haitang not know that as a foreign official, he should maintain a distance of 3,000 miles from the woman the Emperor of Northern Qi wanted? This is where I live. Haitang explained the confusion in Fan Xian's heart. It is not convenient for Lily to enter the palace, so His Majesty has asked me to take care of her. Fan Xian laughed bitterly. Only now did he remember that Sea Lily had once said that these two girls were close friends in the Northern Qi Palace. He suddenly thought of something. Could it be that Ku He also lived in the palace? Although the temple was far away, Fan Xian still had some reservations. After a few casual words he said to Haitang, I will wait for you outside. Without waiting for Haitang and Sea Lily to reply, he left the door and waited outside in the courtyard. After he left, Haitang quietly looked at Sea Lily. After a moment of silence she suddenly said, I brought him here to see you. Don't you have anything to say to him? Sea Lily raised her head, and a trace of confusion flashed across her charming face. She said quietly, I said I don't want to see him, and I reckon he doesn't want to see me either. Right now, he is outside the door, and I don't know how he will complain about you. Haitang, you are too reckless. Even if you are Ku He's disciple, you should do less of this taboo thing. Haitang smiled gently. What is there to be afraid of? Our Majesty is not a petty person. In another elegant and clean small room, wisps of fragrance gradually filled the meditation room. The tea on the table mixed with the amber color of the furniture, making people feel very tranquil. Why did you bring me to see Sea Lily? Fan Xian sat cross-legged on the other side of the tea table, frowning. His elegant face finally showed some worry. He was working hard to make arrangements for Xiao En, but Sea Lily was a hot potato. I told you about Yen Bingyun earlier, Haitang said with a smile. I wanted to see if Master Fan was the same as the other filthy things in the world. The term impure substance is novel and absurd. Have you never read the story of the stone, Master Fan? Haitang seemed surprised. Fan Xian's heart skipped a beat, and he didn't respond. He just smiled bitterly and said, Miss Haitang, have you misunderstood something? Miss Sea Lily is just a criminal I've been escorting along the way. She's just a target in the agreement. I have nothing to do with her. Milord, you've misunderstood me. Haitang said softly, Today, I have invited you to my humble abode because there is something I need your help with. What is it? Fan Xian asked directly. Haitang smiled and said, Actually, it's something His Majesty was worried about when he left you in the palace. Fan Xian looked at her and found that her ordinary face easily made people feel close to her. He asked curiously, "Clearly, His Majesty didn't want you to know about his troubles at the time." Hai Tang used her left hand to gently roll up the sleeve of her right hand. With 2 fingers, she brought a small teacup to her lips. She slowly took a sip and said, "The Emperor truly did not want me to know in the beginning, but his distress and I have been good friends for many years. Furthermore, in the Qi court, there are not many people other than me who are willing to help him resolve this distress." "I've always been confused." Fan Xian could, of course, guess what the young emperor of Northern Qi was worried about. He smiled and said, "Since everyone in the court is opposed to see Lily entering the palace, why does your emperor still insist on going his own way? Looking at the current situation, See Lily can only temporarily stay in Miss Haitong's residence, and presumably the Empress Dowager won't allow her to enter the palace." "Master Fan, are you suspecting that there's more to this matter?" "Correct. I've never believed that there's such a thing as affection in the royal family." For some reason, Fan Xian was faintly unhappy, and his words were much sharper. Hai Tang stared at him calmly. After a while she said, "Emperors are also people. How can you say anything about the matters between men and women?" Fan Xian shook his head and thought of the emperors of his previous world. Perhaps Emperor Xuanzong of Tang was an exception, but in the end, didn't Yang Guifei turn into a wisp of a fragrant soul at Mawei? "Master Fan is already married," Hai Tang said casually. Fan Xian was slightly surprised. He thought of his wife at home, and of their first meeting in front of the incense burner in the Temple of Qing. He couldn't help but smile, full of happiness. Hai Tang looked at his facial expression and sighed to herself. She smiled and said, "I hear that Master Fan and your wife are very close. If someone tried to stop you two from being together, what would you do?" Fan Xian raised his eyebrows and did not reply. But if there really was someone in this world who dared to come between him and Wanner, that person must be seeking death. Gradually, he seemed to understand the feelings of the young emperor in the palace. But when he thought of how the emperor admired Si Lily, Fan Xian still felt a little strange. Even though the agreement between him and Si Lily was that they were only in a mutually beneficial relationship, Haitong's request was actually what Fan Xian wanted. If Si Lily couldn't enter the palace, the only thing that would be lost would be the Overwatch Council of Qing. He just couldn't guess why she would want to find him. Hai Tang said, "No one in the court is willing to help His Majesty welcome Si Lily into the palace. You should know that Si Lily's identity in the south is problematic. After all, I am limited by my status and have no right to speak in this matter." Fan Xian laughed coldly. "She's working for Northern Qi." He then asked, "Do I have any right to speak? I'm just a foreign official." "After Wudu, this matter should have nothing to do with me." Hai Tang smiled. "His Majesty and I only wish to borrow your wisdom, Master Fan." Fan Xian couldn't help but laugh. He gently smoothed down the hair on his head with his fingers. "Miss Hai Tang, you truly think highly of me." Hai Tang calmly said, "Master Fan was originally a nameless person, but in a year's time, you've become the world's most famous immortal poet, a powerful figure in the south. If you say you have no wisdom, no one in the world would believe you." "I'll think of something, but I don't know if it will work." Fan Xian picked up a cup of tea and drank it in one gulp. The key is still the Empress Dowager. If she isn't willing, nothing will work. Hai Tang stood up and bowed slightly. "I thank you in advance. It seems that the relationship between you and Si Lily is not shallow." Fan Xian bowed in return. "If I ever need your help in the future, I hope you will remember the friendship between us today." Hai Tang expressionlessly replied, "As long as it doesn't involve the politics of our country, I promise to do so." Fan Xian said, "Don't worry. What I want you to do may never happen. If it does, it will only be an internal problem of the kingdom of Qing, and you won't have to go against the natural order that you've always pursued." "That's good." Hai Tang relaxed a little. As the head envoy of the south, all of Fan Xian's movements in Shangjing had to be monitored by the court of Northern Qi. This was a tacit understanding and habit between the two sides, so it was rare for him to have complete freedom of movement. But today was an exception. Fan Xian was taking a stroll with Hai Tang, and Hai Tang clearly didn't like the rats of the brocade guard following them, so they walked together under an umbrella. It looked like they were strolling leisurely, but they had thrown off all the spies. He believed that the brocade guard wouldn't have the courage to follow them even after Haitang had clearly expressed her hostility. After leaving the wondrous little temple where the two girls lived, Fan Xian stretched. He didn't see any familiar brocade guard around the corner. A happy smile appeared on his face, and he walked into an alleyway at the corner of the street. There was no clear sky after the rain. Only a cool breeze blew the dew that fell from the branches, brushing past his cheeks. Thinking of Sea Lily and the Emperor, Fan Xian still didn't quite understand. But the topic that Haitang had just mentioned made this 17-year-old man's thoughts return to the capital, to the side of his wife and sister. Homesickness began to rise, and a warm feeling began to fill his chest. Occasionally, pedestrians passed by the alley. Some laborers were pushing handcarts, taking shortcuts to get to the shops where they worked. Fan Xian's face wore a gentle smile, as beautiful as the sun, and he slowly walked toward the alley. A handcart came from behind him, and as it brushed past him, Fan Xian flicked his wrist, and the black dagger he had been holding in his palm stabbed horizontally. With a muffled squelch, the dagger pierced the throat of a spy dressed as a laborer. The cold blade entered the flesh, and the man fell to the ground. In the next moment, Fan Xian was already stepping on the overturned handcart. His whole body floated to the end of the alley like a shadow. His fingers held a poisonous needle, and he stabbed it into a major acupoint in the chest of a man. His left hand strangely shot out from under his right armpit, and 3 crossbow bolts shot out at the same time, nailing a stunned man to death. With a backhand slap, he shattered the neck of the paralyzed man. Fan Xian took off his clothes, turned over, and used the rain hat to cover his face and his sunny smile. He pulled the crossbow bolts from the dead man's body and walked out of the alley. Chapter 229. After leaving the small temple, Fan Xian had been followed by 3 people. He didn't know if they were spies from the brocade guard or people from the palace, but no matter which side they were from, Fan Xian would not allow anyone to follow him today. After pulling out these 3 spies, Fan Xian confirmed that no one was following him, and then he began his next step. After leaving the alley, he did not take a carriage, because any opportunity to come into contact with people could leave behind clues that Northern Qi could find. On the wet street, the number of people gradually increased. Using the crowd as cover, Fan Xian lowered his head and walked silently among the people of a foreign country. According to the Overwatch Council's anti-tailing rules, he should be looking for a cloth shop and then go through a back door. After a few more turns, he would be able to reach his destination. But Fan Xian did not use this method. First, he was confident that no one was following him. Second, he thought that if he made too many turns and came into contact with too many people, it would be easier for him to be discovered. Along the way, he carefully snuck into an official's manor. Coincidentally, it began to rain again in Shangjing. The rain was silent, but it was tangible, and it effectively hid his tracks. Near the musical house in the south of Shangjing, there was a residential area for commoners called Zhangjiadian. This place was a mix of good people and bad people, but it had been relatively safe these past few years. In addition, living expenses were cheap, so it gradually became lively. The small peddlers who did not have much capital began to muster up their courage and save up extra money. They bought a few shops on this street and began to do business. This place was not like Xueqi Street, where daily necessities were sold. The prices were cheap, and the quality was not very good. The third shop from the east was such an ordinary place. This shop sold oil. The oil was palm oil from Dongi. Although it was cheap and tasted good, the color was not very good. Especially during the winter, there was always a layer of white flocculation. So generally, wealthy families with a bit of money would rather use rapeseed oil from the east of Qi. Fortunately, there were always many people who did not have spare money, so this oil shop that did not even have a signboard could still survive. However, they did not dare to hire too many people. Other than an old shopkeeper, they only hired a helper and a waiter. It had rained repeatedly today, so there were not many pedestrians in Zhangjiadian. Today, it seemed even more empty. However, the oil shop's business had nothing to do with the weather. Whoever ran out of oil would naturally come, so the old shopkeeper of the oil shop was not in a hurry. Instead, he moved a long stool and sat in front of his door, staring blankly at the rain outside the shop. Perhaps the shopkeeper was really getting old. The young workers in the shop felt that the number of times the shopkeeper was in a daze this year was much more than before. "Shopkeeper, I want to buy oil." A person stood at the entrance of the oil shop, blocking the dim sunlight outside. The old shopkeeper waved his hand, indicating for him to enter by himself. The man took off his rain hat, revealing a plain face. He smiled, walked into the shop, and said to the yawning shop assistant, "Young man, I want to buy oil." The shop assistant smiled and said, "What kind of oil do you want?" "Other than palm oil, our shop also has a new batch of rapeseed oil from Qidong Lai." The shop assistant's attitude was respectful, but he was muttering to himself, "Of course people who come to our shop want to buy oil. Isn't this nonsense?" The man said, "Give me half a caddy of palm oil." The shop assistant replied crisply, "Okay." He nimbly poured oil into the scale, and then found that the man's hands were empty. He couldn't help but scratch his head. "Sir, what do you use to carry it? Do you have a pot here?" "Yes, a wooden pot is 3 copper coins." The shop assistant was very happy to have made another business. The man did not speak after taking the oil pot, as if he was still thinking about something. The shop assistant asked curiously, "What else do you want? Do you have sesame oil? Do you have sesame oil?" The question was very soft and not very loud, but the old shopkeeper's withered right hand, which was sitting outside the shop and propping itself up on the bench, trembled slightly. The shop assistant said unhappily, "We don't have such good goods in our shop. In the whole of Zhangjiadian, who can afford to eat sesame oil?" As he spoke, the old shopkeeper had already slowly walked back to the counter and waved his hand to signal the shop assistant to leave. He looked at the customer with a face full of smiles and explained, "Sesame oil is too expensive. Except for when it's used to worship the heavens, no one usually buys it. There's still half a year until the day of worship, so our shop hasn't stocked up yet." The man smiled and said, "Other than worshipping the heavens, worshipping people is also possible." The old shopkeeper's smile became even more respectful. He said, "Then tell me the quantity. We can order it on your behalf." The conversation had reached a crucial point, so both of them spoke softly. However, that person's memory must be very good, so he was able to clearly state the weight of the next batch without any ambiguity. "I want to buy 7 caddies, 3 taels, 9 chen and 4 hao palm oil." The old shopkeeper was calculating with his abacus, and then he looked troubled. He said, "There's a problem with the price. Sir, let's go into the inner room and talk." "That's fine." The old shopkeeper ordered the shop assistant to keep watch outside, and then he led the customer into the back room. The shop assistant now knew that the man wasn't here to buy oil, but to sell oil. He couldn't help but stick out his tongue, thinking that he was lucky he hadn't offended the owner of the sesame oil business. This sesame oil merchant was, of course, Fan Xian in disguise. He followed the old shopkeeper into the back room, only to find that it was completely different from the meeting place he had imagined. It was actually bright and clear. There was no tea, no small talk. The old shopkeeper stared into Fan Xian's eyes, and there was a trace of caution in his old muddy eyes. He said, "Sir, you came from the south?" Fan Xian nodded. The old shopkeeper made a gesture of invitation. Fan Xian sighed in his heart, thinking that Yan Bingyun's procedure was a bit complicated. Helpless, he could only report another number that he had firmly memorized. Only now did the old shopkeeper confirm the other party's identity. Only then did he relax. He took out a small knife dipped in poison from his sleeve with trembling hands and placed it in his hand. Fan Xian knew that if the man was a spy from the kingdom of Qi, the old shopkeeper would have to kill him as soon as possible. This was also why Yan Bingyun felt so humiliated after being captured alive. The old shopkeeper looked at him and said, "Sir, what position do you hold in the Overwatch Council?" Fan Xian shook his head. "I don't think the situation at hand allows us to be long-winded." The old shopkeeper laughed bitterly. "It's already been a year. It's been a whole year since we've received any news from above. After the incident, the court hasn't sent anyone to take over. I thought the court was going to let us enter a period of silence." The so-called period of silence was when, as soon as a gap appeared in the spy system of an enemy country, they would immediately stop all operations to avoid being exposed. This period could only be a month, or it could be 10 years. Fan Xian frowned. Yan Bingyun's capture was the most unlikely thing to happen in a spy war between the two countries, because Yan Bingyun didn't need to carry intelligence back to his country and personally investigate such dangerous matters. But the eldest princess's move had paralyzed the entire network of the Overwatch Council in the north. Yan Bingyun had always been in the hands of Northern Qi, and the court and the Overwatch Council didn't dare to take the risk of contacting them. That was why there had been a year of silence. I hope that after a year of silence, everyone's bodies haven't rusted. Sir, please be at ease. The old shopkeeper knew that if this man had come to take over Yan Bingyun's position, he must be an important figure in the council, and he could faintly smell the scent of blood on him. The old shopkeeper's reply was especially careful. Sir, please give the order. 3 matters, some urgent, some slow. Fan Xian looked at the old man in front of him. He knew that this old man, as well as the countless other spies in the council, must have had a difficult year. They were like wandering orphans with no home to return to, so he deliberately softened his tone. The most urgent thing is to immediately find out where Xueqi is being held. The second matter is to investigate the real reason for the enmity between the Empress Dowager and the Emperor. This was something that Fan Xian had never understood. The young emperor seemed to have eaten too much. The old shopkeeper's expression didn't change. Although he knew that either of these 2 tasks would be extremely difficult, he only quietly waited for the man in front of him to issue the third order. Investigate Xueqi's matter quickly. The matters in the palace can wait. Fan Xian muttered to himself. As for the third order, I think you should know that the palace treasury has been smuggling goods northward for the past few years. The old shopkeeper narrowed his eyes. For the first time, a strange light appeared in his eyes. That is a problem in Xinjiang. Sir, has the council finally decided to act? Fan Xian shook his head and quietly said, Investigate. Investigate thoroughly for me. However, don't touch a single hair on them. You have to control all of the joints that can be controlled. If the council wants to act in the future, you have to make sure you have enough things in your hands to salvage this entire trail clean. Understood. The old shopkeeper knew that this was a long-term task that could be taken slowly. But Fan Xian was thinking about something else. He didn't know if the matter with Master Cui was a test from his mother-in-law, or if she had something to ask of him, so he had to bear with it for now. Although Xinjiang had never known that Fan Xian was the culprit behind the incident with Yanji and Guangxin Palace, the conflict in the Great Hall of the Ministry of Justice had gradually brought the conflict between him and the eldest princess to the surface. Chapter 230. How should I reply, sir? This was a crucial point. Fan Xian didn't know how Yan Bingyun had managed to communicate with his subordinates, so he didn't dare act rashly. He only said quietly, within 2 months, there shouldn't be any specific executors coming to Shangjing, but I will temporarily assign someone to be responsible for contacting you. The old shopkeeper looked worried. Sir, please be careful. Although the brocade guard of Northern Qi couldn't compare to the Red Cavalry of Northern Wei in the past 20 years since Xueqi was captured, I still have to consider the children under me. Fan Xian nodded. This was why the Overwatch Council hadn't dared to take the risk of contacting these orphans, even after a year. He said quietly, Don't worry. The person I'm looking for is the one least likely to be followed in the council. Without question, he was talking about Wang Qinian, the one who had spent his entire life following others, but had never been followed by anyone. He couldn't stay in this place for long. After saying a few more words, Fan Xian got up and prepared to leave. Before he left, he suddenly said, Change the secret signal. Yes, sir. The old shopkeeper bowed slightly. 1314527777777. Yes, sir. The old shopkeeper repeated the seemingly random number without a single mistake. Fan Xian nodded, somewhat satisfied. He returned to the front hall and saluted the old shopkeeper like a merchant, not forgetting to carry the 2 pots of tung oil in his hands. Seeing the merchant leave, the young shopkeeper joked, Boss, you're ready to bring in the oil so early? The old shopkeeper looked at the only shopkeeper in the shop and smiled. Yes, there's a big deal coming. The shopkeeper thought to himself, could his shabby oil shop be like those oil merchants in Dongyi and do a few big deals? A few hundred caddies of business was a big deal. The young man couldn't help but look down on the shopkeeper's lack of ambition. On the way, Fan Xian carefully disposed of the oil in his hands. He didn't dare give it to the beggars on the street, nor did he dare throw it away. One of the most important rules of the Overwatch Council's secret agents was not to underestimate the enemy's ability. Although Shen Zhong, the commander of the Brocade Guard of Northern Qi, did not appear to be very powerful in that rainy night in the brothel, Fan Xian knew that was definitely just a facade. After cleanly disposing of the oil pot, Fan Xian set out on his way back to the diplomatic mission. The sky was already dark, and there were few people on the road. As he passed the arch bridge over the Yuchuan River in Shangjing, Fan Xian rubbed his face a few times under the canopy, wiping away all of the rouge and rouge from the young lady's home. He squeezed it into a small yellow and red powder in his palm. His palm gently stroked the lion on the stone arch bridge. The powder fell from his palm and quietly mixed with the river water under the bridge. No one could find any trace of it. Descending the bridge and passing through the alley, Fan Xian emerged from the side of a house. He had already restored his original appearance. He had taken off his rain hat and flipped his robe. He looked just like he had when he had just parted with Hai Tang. His face was delicate and his expression elegant. He swaggered back to the diplomatic mission. The brocade guard, who had been drinking tea for many days, looked at him strangely. Fan Xian knew that the news of the 3 spies' deaths must have reached Shen Zhong's ears. But the brocade guard could only swallow this loss. As for when they would be able to retaliate, that was not within Fan Xian's scope of consideration. In the most secluded courtyard of the courtyard, under the long eaves, Yan Bingyun was lying on a low couch. The couch was piled with soft brocade blankets. Although Fan Xian had treated his wounds, the torment he had suffered over the past year could not be healed in a short period of time. His body was injured all over, and could not withstand strong contact. So Fan Xian thought of a way to bury him in a pile of cotton. Fortunately, the weather had not been too hot. Although he knew that this indifferent northern spy chief was now physically and mentally exhausted and needed time to rest, Fan Xian still felt a bit ashamed to disturb him. Because in these last few days in northern Qi, he had to rely on Yan Bingyun's methods. After a brief explanation of the day's situation, Yan Bingyun looked at Fan Xian gloomily and said quietly, "I hope you did not leave behind any traces. Otherwise, if all my subordinates were to be uprooted, even if you are the commissioner of the council, I will definitely report you." Fan Xian shook his head. "I know you have more power than just this line of communication. Although one-way communication is safe, the efficiency is too low. You must think of a way to move the other areas as well. But I don't think I have the time to deal with them. I am going to hand them over to Wang Qinian. What do you think of this proposal?" A strange look flashed in Yan Bingyun's eyes. This was the youngest high-ranking official of the council. These days, his performance could only be described as average. His greatest strength was that he was good at listening to Yan Bingyun's opinions. But today, he had exposed the northern network with a single sentence. It seemed that he had some ability. "I am not worried about Wang Qinian." He thought for a moment. Master Wang is one of the earliest people to be hidden in the north. Fan Xian was slightly surprised. He had not expected Wang Qinian to have done such a thing. He heard Yan Bingyun say, "According to your plan, we will cooperate with Shang Shanhu to dig out Xiaowen's whereabouts. But I do not want the people of the council to get too involved." Fan Xian agreed to his request. He knew that Yan Bingyun did not want the people hidden in the north to sacrifice too many lives for the sake of the internal strife of the court. "Don't worry. I know what I am doing." Yan Bingyun frowned. Shang Shanhu is a lion. Unfortunately, in the deep waters of Shangjing, he could not find a place to borrow his strength. That is why he sought the help of the eldest princess. As officials, it is only natural that you and I act according to the will of the eldest princess. However, you must know your limits. I believe that the day Shang Shanhu makes his move to save Xiaowen will be the day the Empress Dowager and Shen Zhong purge the army. Fan Xian knew that this cold-faced official of the Overwatch Council had guessed what he wanted to do, so he didn't say anything more. He only said quietly, "This is exactly what I want to see. I will not underestimate Shen Zhong's ability to monitor Shangjing. Let them fight it out. In any case, it will not harm the kingdom of Qing." Leaving the rear courtyard, Fan Xian found Wang Qinian and gave him the task. Wang Qinian remembered the string of numbers clearly. He knew that in the following days, he would have to shoulder this dangerous and important task. He was not the old shopkeeper of the oil shop. He was Fan Xian's most trusted aide, and so he gathered his courage and asked, 13145277777. "Master, this string of numbers seems to represent something." "All my life, I love money money money." Fan Xian laughed. In the dialect of Danzhou, the pronunciation of money and 7 was very similar. The old shopkeeper of the oil shop had been doing well these past few days. He had sold a few barrels of oil, and a piece of information hidden in the dark began to circulate through the northern department of the 4th Bureau of the Overwatch Council, which had been silent for a year. It did not take long for the spies, who had disguised themselves as the various commoners of northern Qi, to receive their first task after a year. The information began to be fed back through various channels. It was summarized at several points on the line, and finally delivered to the oil shop in Zhangjiadian. At the same time, the Qing diplomatic mission held a few banquets, and their drinking capacity had increased considerably. Naturally, shopkeeper Shang of Xueqi Street could not help but make a few trips to the diplomatic mission's courtyard, and flatter Fan Xian a few times. He believed that from Fan Xian, he had obtained the information that Xinyang and Shang Shanhu had always wanted. The person who handled a lot of information and analyzed it, and finally came to a relatively accurate conclusion was Yan Bingyun. Over the past few days, the sound of his coughing could often be heard coming from the rear courtyard. Fan Xian did not have much to do. After all, he was the head of the diplomatic mission. Drinking and greeting were the proper things to do. On this day, he entered the palace accompanied by Hai Tang. A few days ago, Hai Tang had told him that the Empress Dowager had invited him to the palace to discuss important matters. Drinking, for Fan Xian, had always been a happy thing, and drinking with the Empress Dowager of an enemy country was not a depressing matter. But when Fan Xian returned to the diplomatic mission, all of his officials and subordinates knew that he was in a bad mood, but no one knew why. Inside the room, Fan Xian looked coldly at Lin Jing. In this diplomatic mission, am I the head envoy, or is it you, Sir Lin? Lin Jing was uneasy. Why do you say that, Sir Fan? He asked nervously. Naturally, the diplomatic mission will follow your lead. Good. Fan Xian laughed. Then tell me, Sir Lin, why did the Empress Dowager say that the Princess of Northern Qi was going to be married to the great prince of our dynasty? What a big deal. Why was it that I did not know about this even after I left? You had already made all the arrangements for the princess marriage at the office of the Grand Herald and Taichung Temple. Only now did I know that I had to send off the bride on my way back. Lin Jing let out a sigh of relief. So that was what had happened. He laughed. Sir, he replied, please do not blame me and Sir Lin Wan. The diplomatic mission only passed on the Empress Dowager's handwritten letter to the Empress Dowager of Northern Qi. How could we, the officials, have known that it was 2 women who had decided on the marriage of their own children in the letter? When word of this came out of the palace, what could we say? We were supposed to inform you of this, sir, but you have been away from the diplomatic mission for a few days, so we were delayed. Lin Jing rolled his eyes. He knew that this young man was a little angry. He smiled and handed over a letter. The official letter will arrive soon. This is a secret letter from the court, expressing the attitude of His Majesty and the Empress Dowager. Of course, they are willing to carry out this marriage. In fact, there are 2 other happy events that I wish to congratulate you, Sir Fan. Chapter 231. Congratulations, my ass. Making a scene. As soon as Fan Xian thought of all the things that had happened, he was furious. He even learned Chen Pingping's catchphrase and laughed. Those old women eat too much pickled vegetables and worry too much. Aren't they afraid that they'll tire us runners to death? Lin Wen was startled. What a disgraceful thing to say. He hurriedly explained, the affairs of the court have their own rules. But the affairs of the palace have their own channels. You don't need to worry too much, sir. Fan Xian nodded. Although this marriage seemed a bit ridiculous, seeing how anxious the 2 courts were, it was a situation that everyone wanted to see. But Southern Qing and Northern Qi were known as the 2 most powerful countries in the world. If these 2 countries were to unite by marriage, the emperors of the small countries hiding far away would probably not be happy. Of course, the biggest headache would be the city of Dongyi, which was guarded by Sigu Jian's sword. Oh right. You said I have something to celebrate? Fan Xian frowned. He didn't know what the great prince's marriage, which was scheduled to return to the capital in early autumn, had to do with him. Lin Jing and Lin Wen looked at each other and laughed. Sir, you'll know when you read the letter from the court. According to custom, when the court sent a letter, if the head envoy was not present, Lin Jing, as the deputy envoy, had the authority to open it first. Go ahead. Fan Xian rubbed the space between his brows. He didn't know where this feeling came from, but it was getting stronger and stronger. Yes. Lin Jing responded with a smile. After the great prince's marriage is set, so is the second prince's. His Majesty has decreed that the second prince's marriage to Yi Linger, the daughter of the Yi family of the Jingdou garrison, is set for next spring. Fan Xian was a little surprised. He grunted, and felt a strange feeling in his heart. The girl who had called him teacher by the lake was also going to be married? He had seen the second prince before, and knew that the second prince was well-read, but had a restless heart. Hearing that Yi Linger was going to marry the second prince, he couldn't help but worry for her. At the same time, he wondered what the emperor wanted to do. This marriage would clearly tie the Yi family, which guarded the capital, to the second prince. Did the emperor really want to change the heir? Fan Xian's heart jumped, but his expression was unusually calm. He tilted his head slightly and said, "What does this have to do with me?" Lin Wen said with a flattering smile, "Congratulations, Master Fan. Congratulations, Master Fan." His Majesty also mentioned in his edict that the young lady of your manor is virtuous, and that she has been granted marriage to Li Hongqing, Crown Prince of King Jing, young miss of your noble family. Fan Xian was a little confused, and felt a little stupid. Which manor was this? It took him a while to react. Could it be Ruoruo? Sister Ruoruo was going to marry Li Hongqing? No. To everyone's surprise, Fan Xian suddenly stood up and waved his sleeve. The officials next to him had their mouths wide open. They didn't know why Fan Xian would have such a strong reaction after hearing about his sister's marriage. Everyone congratulated Fan Xian. His congratulations came from the bottom of his heart. Count Sinan was the Minister of Appointments, and was in charge of the Qing Kingdom's finances. Fan Xian was the Commissioner of the Overwatch Council, and His Majesty had arranged for him to marry the daughter of the former Prime Minister. That young lady also had a noble identity that everyone knew, but did not dare mention. Now, even the young lady of the Fan family had been betrothed to Crown Prince Li Hongqing. There was no one else in the court who was so favored by the emperor. Fan Xian's reaction was, "No." Fan Xian lost his composure for a moment. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the stunned expressions on everyone's faces. His mind was a mess, but he quickly came to his senses and laughed. "That won't do. Li Hongqing visits brothels every day. If he doesn't spend a few hundred jars of fine wine with me, my brother-in-law, I won't let my sister marry him." He hid it well. The officials all knew that the Fan family was on good terms with King Jing's family, and that he was good friends with Crown Prince Jing. His words were indeed a joke. The officials all laughed. They said that Fan Xian was humorous, and that when they returned to the capital, they would visit him at his manor. Some even said that they would go with Fan Xian to find Crown Prince Jing and extort some fine wine. Fan Xian's eyebrows danced as he happily chatted with the officials. He was very much like a happy brother who had heard that his sister was about to get married. After everyone had dispersed, Fan Xian walked alone to the secluded rear courtyard. Standing next to a pillar, he looked at the stars emerging from the gaps in the dark clouds in the southern sky. He was silent for a long time. His sister was going to get married. His sister was going to get married. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes, watching the dim stars twinkling between the heavy clouds in the night sky. His heart palpitated, and his mind was filled with that sentence. He had long known that this was something that was bound to happen. Not long after he had come to this world, when he was in Danzhou telling the story of Snow White to the yellow-haired girl, Fan Xian knew that the yellow-skinned monkey in front of him would one day get married. In the letters that came and went between Danzhou and the capital, he would occasionally think that the little girl on the other end of the letter would grow up to marry a man. Later, when he came to the capital, he saw that there was a trace of ice and snow hidden between her brows. She was also as intelligent as ice and snow. She saw him as a teacher and respected him as a brother. Fan Xian laughed and thought that if any ordinary man married her in the future, he would certainly have a hard time. But at some point, perhaps from the day Fan Xian guessed his past, Fan Xian began to subconsciously refuse to think about the future of Ruoruo's sister. Even when the emperor, who was traveling incognito, told the siblings in the tea house by the Lujing River that he would arrange a good marriage for Ruoruo in the future, Fan Xian still refused to think about it. But things never changed according to one's will. After Fan Xian got married, Ruoruo's marriage naturally became a problem that had to be solved immediately. Fan Xian unconsciously gently patted the pillar next to him. His mind was a mess. Although he had once talked about this problem with his sister and vowed that as her brother, he would definitely find her a good husband, when it came to matters like this, Fan Xian, who always liked to pretend to be confused, was in a rare state of confusion. It was as if there were countless threads running back and forth in his mind, making it difficult for him to breathe and unable to think. Clap, clap, clap. The sound of palms hitting the pillar echoed softly in the courtyard. Very noisy. A cold voice came from the other end of the corridor. Fan Xian laughed bitterly. He had been so shaken up today that he had forgotten that the courtyard he lived in was also occupied by the equally cold Yan Bingyun. Sir, your mind seems to be in a mess today. Yan Bingyun wasn't concerned about him. He was just curious as to why this commissioner of the Overwatch Council, who was used to hiding all his thoughts and only giving others the appearance of sunshine, was so sad tonight. Fan Xian pulled his gaze back from the dark night sky. He thought for a moment and then said, "My sister is going to get married." "The young lady of the Fan family?" Yan Bingyun said quietly. "A famous and talented woman in the capital. Presumably, it was His Majesty who arranged the marriage." "Correct. My future brother-in-law is Crown Prince Jing, Li Hongqing." Yan Bingyun said, "All the young people in the capital know that the Crown Prince likes your sister." Fan Xian was surprised. "Really? Why don't I know? I heard that you and Li Hongqing had a good deal." "Now that your manor is connected by marriage with King Jing, in the southern court, other than a few members of the royal family, there are no officials who can compare to the Fan manor." "I must congratulate you, sir." Fan Xian felt that Yan Bingyun's cold congratulations were mixed with a hint of malice. He tilted his head slightly and smiled. "It is indeed a happy occasion." "If it is a happy occasion, why are you worried, sir?" Fan Xian smiled. "Hongqing is my friend. Of course I like his temperament, but..." He shrugged. "A dissolute prince who frequents pleasure boats is about to become my brother-in-law. I think anyone would be worried." Yan Bingyun coughed lightly and said mockingly, "Have you never been to a brothel in your life, Sir Fan?" Fan Xian smiled and shook his head. He was in a strange mood today, so he didn't want to argue with Yan Bingyun. There were no candles in the room, and the stars in the sky could be counted. The courtyard was dark. Fan Xian turned his head and saw Yan Bingyun's cold expression, which couldn't be erased in the night. He suddenly had a thought and blurted out, "Do you want to marry my sister?" "Nonsense." Yan Bingyun rebuked the commissioner for his absurd question. Fan Xian shrugged and sighed. "You're right. You only love yourself. How would you know how to love a woman?" Yan Bingyun didn't want to pay attention to him. Fan Xian looked at him and said, "How do you and Miss Shen end up?" "She was cheated by you. Shen Zhong isn't someone to be trifled with." Yan Bingyun's face was as cold as ice, but Fan Xian's sharp eyes finally found a trace of sadness in his eyes for the first time. He only heard him say quietly, "I'm not a pervert like you. As for Shen, there's nothing between me and her." Fan Xian understood that Yan Bingyun and Miss Shen were destined to be apart for the rest of their lives, looking at each other from afar. Although he didn't know if Yan Bingyun had any feelings for her in the process, he felt some guilt towards such an infatuated woman. His thoughts turned back to Ruoro's marriage, and a faint worry floated up in his heart. Actually, everyone was right. His sister marrying Li Hongqing was better than marrying one of the princes. Fan Xian should be happy, but he couldn't be happy. Actually, in his heart, even he didn't know what he was thinking. Perhaps it was only some details, some initial reactions, such as standing up in front of him and the sad clapping of his hands afterwards, that revealed the deepest desires in Fan Xian's heart that he didn't even realize he had. He said to Yan Bingyun in the corridor, "Miss Shen naturally can't marry you, but if, and I'm saying if there was such a possibility, what would you do?" "I never think of the impossible," Yan Bingyun replied coldly. Fan Xian smiled and left the long corridor. Yan Bingyun watched his lonely figure disappear into the darkness and fell into deep thought. Chapter 232. 3 marriages, just 3 small interludes that seemed to be the case. No one knew of Fan Xian's troubles. Whenever he thought of that faint possibility, Fan Xian felt a chill run through his body, and he didn't know what to say. Far away in a foreign country, Wu Zhu, the only person who had no taboos, seemed to have disappeared. There was no one he could talk to about this. There was nothing that couldn't be said to others, but this couldn't be said to others. In the eyes of others, Fan Xian seemed to be very happy, and had already begun to make arrangements for the diplomatic mission's return to the capital. The officials thought that Fan Xian was rushing back to the capital to prepare for his sister's marriage, and at the same time, wanted to seize the opportunity to benefit from the court's arrangements after the marriage. No one knew that under Fan Xian's calm, even joyful appearance, he had long since shaken off the shock of the time, and had begun to act according to the plan he had devised long ago, step by step. Yan Bingyun's words helped Fan Xian to a certain extent. Fan Xian thought that Sir Yan was right to a certain extent. What was the point of thinking so much about something that was impossible? But at the same time, he told himself that if Ruoruo was willing to marry, as her brother, he would make sure her marriage was glorious, happy, and blessed. Even if Li Hongqing was involved in the second prince's struggle for the throne, for Ruoruo's sake, he would ensure the peace of King Jing's manor. Of course, if Ruoruo did not want to marry, then it would be a completely different story. Having thought this through, Fan Xian regained his calm, or at least on the surface. He had entered the palace twice these past few days, mainly to deal with the first marriage alliance since the founding of the two countries. This was an important matter, and no one, including Fan Xian, dared to be negligent. What made Fan Xian somewhat happy was that, under the pressure of the harem, Shen Zhong and Chong Ningho had finally lowered their heads. The secret service organizations of the two countries had a preliminary idea of how to distribute the goods from the north through irregular channels, as well as specific measures. In this plan, Fan Xian, as an important figure in both the Overwatch Council and the palace treasury, would naturally reap the most benefits. In reality, what Fan Xian was happy about was not the matter itself. Although his plans in the future would require financial support, the gains from smuggling were not as great as Fan Xian's plans. What truly made him happy was that, since he was going to make changes to the channel, then the output of goods from Xinjiang would certainly be reduced, and the income would certainly be reduced. The eldest princess power would presumably be weakened. Fan Xian also understood that the eldest princess had allowed this to happen because he had promised Xinjiang that he would cooperate with Shang Shanhu and rescue Xiao En, who was hiding a shocking secret. This seemed to show that the eldest princess still placed the interests of the Qing court above her own. This, which was a bit like an act, surprised Fan Xian. It was also during these few days that the patient Yan Bingyun's ability to plan things was demonstrated to its greatest extent. When Fan Xian held the case file, he couldn't help but sigh in admiration. Yan Bingyun's methods were simple, but they were the safest and most appropriate. They preserved the safety of the Qing forces hidden in the north to the greatest extent. There were many kinds of spies in the Qing kingdom. Yan Bingyun controlled secret agents, such as the oil shopkeepers and the attendants hidden in the manors of the nobles, and even some officials. There were also open spies, such as the shopkeepers on Xueqi Street and the merchants from the south. Their main purpose was to do business, but they traveled the world, so they naturally had to send useful information back to the Qing kingdom. These few days, open spies and secret agents began to exert themselves. The intelligence system, which had been in hibernation for a year, began to awaken, and immediately displayed its powerful investigative abilities. Everything was ready. All that was left was for Shang Shanhu to make his move. Fan Xian and Yan Bingyun sat in the diplomatic mission, drinking wine in a relaxed manner. Fan Xian looked at the extremely cold Yan Bingyun and said, "Sir Yan, you are my subordinate after all. Can you not give me that look every day?" "I am not a flattering subordinate," Yan Bingyun replied coldly. Fan Xian smiled. He knew that this man in front of him, who had been hiding in northern Qi for 4 years, had many different faces. Back then, who could have guessed that the great scholar Yun, the son of a sea merchant, who wandered among the nobles, was actually the head spy of the Qing kingdom? Such a person had to be very good at socializing, and very good at using money and power. Yan Bingyun was treating Fan Xian coldly because he was his superior, and not because he was the target he wanted to deal with. Northern Qi really is stupid. Fan Xian took a sip of tea. "I can't believe they let you out so early and let you stay in the diplomatic mission for so many days. If it were me, I wouldn't trade you for 10 divisions." This was an allusion from Fan Xian's previous life. Yan Bingyun didn't feel anything when he heard it, nor was he moved in the slightest. Perhaps they thought the royal court was stupid enough to trade Xiao En for me. Thinking of this, Yan Bingyun still felt a little depressed. But Northern Qi didn't have much use for Xiao En, and they still had to think of a way to kill him. That was stupid to the extreme. Fan Xian sighed and said, "Someone once said that a country is like a person. It can never be a perfectly functioning machine. Often, it changes according to the mood of the ruler." The royal family of northern Qi was divided, but Ku He's light was too bright, so they imprisoned Xiao En again. If Shang Shanhu wasn't Xiao En's adopted son, I don't think anyone would dare to challenge the royal family's decision. "What about you?" Yan Bingyun frowned. "On the way north, you clearly had the opportunity to kill Xiao En, but you let him go. Now he's already in Shangjing, and you want to save him. After saving him, you want to." It really is a little strange. Fan Xian smiled. He wouldn't tell anyone about Xiao En's secret, and it was because of this that the process of this matter gradually became absurd and laughable. He thought about it and explained to Yan Bingyun, "This is like playing chess. Although we all want to checkmate the other side's general in the end, the process of moving the pawns is different, and the benefits we gain from it are also different." If he had killed Xiao En on the banks of Wudu, the pawn Fan Xian had intended to abandon might not have been able to return to his country alive, and Fan Xian would never know where the temple was. And this time, he had used all the power of the Overwatch Council in the north to rescue Xiao En. Fan Xian only wanted to set up a common chessboard game, hoping that after so many twists and turns, he could gain something that even Chen Pingping couldn't. If Xiao En doesn't escape from prison, the brocade guard won't be easy to kill. After all, Shang Shanhu's reputation in the northern Qi military is very high. "Xiao En, that old devil. What a pitiful life." A voice sighed. "He's old, and no longer the same as he was. I don't recommend you do it yourself." Yan Bingyun looked at him coldly. "If Ku He really does put down his pride and make a move, how will you survive?" Fan Xian was silent. He didn't dare let anyone else hear Xiao En's secret, so he had to take the risk himself. He slowly tapped the tea table, closing his eyes and imagining himself as a chess player, moving the chessboard clumsily and inexperienced. On both sides of the chessboard were, of course, experienced and far-sighted people. Ku He and the eldest princess, the Empress Dowager and Shang Shanhu. Compared to these people, Fan Xian was nothing. But Wan Tong had no other ability, but he had the courage to flip the chessboard. All the routine work was done. The diplomatic mission and the northern Qi court breathed a sigh of relief and began to feast to their heart's content. Fan Xian was no exception. In the peaceful capital, the only strange thing was that along the banks of Yuchuan River, there had been a number of strange murders. Along with these murders, there had been particularly frightening cases of arson. For a few days, the flames reflected a red glow on the river that the people of northern Qi loved. Fan Xian knew very well what was hidden behind these murders. When the intelligence agents of the kingdom of Qing, who had hibernated for a whole year, began to move, the provost of the brocade guard, Shen Zhong, must have smelled something amiss. The brocade guard, who had taken root among the people of Shangjing, also began to react fiercely and appropriately. Yan Bingyun estimated that some of the hidden sentries he had set up had already been lost in these murders. After all, in a foreign country, it was impossible to conduct such a large transaction right under the nose of the enemy without alerting them. But the 4th Bureau's intelligence network in the north had been split into several pieces, so there was no fear of the brocade guard digging up too many strongholds. So Yan Bingyun's expression became more and more gloomy. The 4th Bureau of the Overwatch Council only had 17 spies in Shangjing. And now, for the sake of the eldest princess and Xiao En, they had paid such a heavy price. He could not help but be angry. Fan Xian did not say anything to comfort him, nor did he say anything. He just continued to drink, seek pleasure, and call in prostitutes. The 6th year of the Tianbao Kingdom, the 6th day of the 6th month of the Great Qi Kingdom. Fan Xian did not believe in the Western legends of the devil from his previous life, so his fingers were steady as he buttoned his cloak. He appeared full of confidence. He carefully sorted out his weapons and medicines. Some were in his belt, some were in his undergarments. Tied to his left forearm was a hidden crossbow that could fire 3 bolts at the same time. The 3rd Bureau of the Overwatch Council's secret smoking powder was in a bag about the size of a knuckle on his right wrist. Fan Xian looked at the metal box on the table, which was illuminated by the dim light, and narrowed his eyes. After the box was opened, there were 3 pills, red, blue, and white. They looked strange, and always made people think of some very strange things. The red pill was not small, but the smell of medicine had faded. It was impossible to tell what it was made of. Many years ago, Fei Jie had left it behind because he was worried about the tyrannical Xueqi in his body. Fan Xian thought for a moment, then hid the large longan-like pill in his belt. Looking at the remaining pills, Fan Xian laughed bitterly. He overturned his original idea and put them all away. He might run into that great grandmaster, so it was better to have more life-saving items. Chapter 233. After hiding the pill, Fan Xian twitched his nose. For some reason, his brain began to feel excited, and the powerful Xueqi in his body began to circulate rapidly along his wide meridians. It was as if every pore on his body had opened up, greedily absorbing the yuan-qi that might or might not have existed between heaven and earth. The faint smell of ephedra excited Fan Xian. From the table, he took down the tiger guard long knife, which had been modified beyond recognition. He weighed its weight in his hand and carefully used a cloth belt to tie the knife to his back, maintaining the most convenient angle for him to draw the knife. As for the slender black dagger on his leg, it seemed to have become a part of him over the years, and he did not need to pay special attention to it. With a creak, the door was pushed open. Wang Qinian walked in, bowed to Fan Xian, and whispered something in his ear. Fan Xian nodded and glanced at the remaining chores on the table, indicating for him to start. Wang Qinian smiled awkwardly. "My skills are much worse than yours, sir." Fan Xian scolded him. "You have never seen me with makeup on. How do you know your skills are worse than mine? You were a wanted thief in many countries back in the day. Did you not know how to disguise yourself? Wasn't the person sitting next to you personally dressed up?" Wang Qinian lightly flattered him. "Heh, that skill. Others may not know, but in my eyes, you are an immortal from heaven." "You're talking nonsense." Fan Xian sat down on a stool and smiled. "Which of the clay statues in the temples next to the capital could be prettier than me?" One was thick-skinned, and the other was thick-skinned. The two of them made up a few words, effectively dispelling the last bit of nervousness in Fan Xian's heart. Wang Qinian was his closest subordinate. Apart from following him outside Songzhou and being responsible for intelligence, he had not played an important role. Fortunately, he had the skill to play the supporting role, which made things easier for Fan Xian. Wang Qinian picked up the knife and scraped at Fan Xian's eyebrows. He then took a handful of wet ash from the table and began to apply it to Fan Xian's face. He felt that the stickiness and color were still somewhat different from the commissioner's facial skin. He couldn't help but frown. "Stick flour is still better." Fan Xian sighed and said, "Where can I find them? I did sneak into an official's house to get some makeup powder and rouge, and the effect was pretty good." In a large mansion in the south of the city, torches were held high in the extremely spacious courtyard. A dozen or so black-clothed men covered from head to toe were silently waiting. On the other side of the courtyard, a middle-aged man was sitting on an armchair with his eyes closed, deep in thought. His right hand was gently stroking the glossy black armrest of the armchair. His feet seemed casual, but in reality, they were as solemn as a mountain as he stepped on the blue stone bricks. This was General Shang Shanhu, who had resisted the barbarians to the north of the kingdom of Qi for 7 years. He was one of the most famous generals in the world, and the most powerful and prestigious in the northern Qi military. After a long while, Shang Shanhu slowly opened his tiger-like eyes. 2 frightening cold lights stared at the man kneeling in front of him. "Since the palace has not given me a way out," he said quietly, "I will not sit and wait for death. You must be careful. Although those people in the south want to do me a favor, who knows what they are really thinking?" His voice was not loud, but it was deep and resounding, like the ringing of a bell. One could imagine the powerful internal energy of this famous general. The man kneeling in front of him was Tan Wu, who had been living his days in Shangjing. He was the fierce general who had been subdued by Gao Da in one move in front of the diplomatic mission. He cupped his fists and said, "General, the Southerners are cunning. You must be careful." "I know what I am doing," said Shang Shanhu. Today was the last time he had entered the palace. The young emperor still had not given him a definite answer. The Empress Dowager had insisted on imprisoning Xiao En, and Shang Shanhu was worried about his adopted father's safety. That was why he had been forced to do something that violated the laws of heaven. As expected, the descendants of the Zhan family will not let go of any opportunity. Shang Shanhu smiled bitterly. If it were not for the fact that his adopted father knew the secret, the young emperor would certainly have done him a favor. But although the young emperor was a bit feminine, he still retained the heroic spirit that Zhang Qingfeng had left behind. He would not let go of a chance to increase the strength of the country in a short period of time, or even to conquer the south. So it was impossible for his adopted father Xiao En to leave that prison alive. Thinking of his adopted father's decades of misery, this general who had been summoned back to Shangjing felt sad. Go! He gently waved his hand and returned to the rear courtyard. His wife was in a hurry to prepare a gift for the Empress Dowager's birthday in a few days. Yes. Tan Wu half knelt on the ground and left. In a residential area outside the Chongwu Gate of Shangjing, there was an inconspicuous little yard. Narrow alleys crisscrossed this residential area. Even an old Shangjing resident would be in danger of getting lost. A few dozen feet away from the courtyard, there were some trees that were commonly seen in the north. The trees were as straight as swords, and their white bark was very obvious in the dark. Fortunately, it was already summer, and there had been plenty of rain this year, so the leaves were especially lush. Fan Xian carefully adjusted his zhenqi, valiantly controlling the pulse of his heart. He allowed his body, shrouded in black, to blend in with the surrounding environment to ensure that no one would discover him. His gaze pierced through the palm-sized leaves, looking down at the house to his right. He calmly waited for Shang Shanhu to begin his rescue of Xiao En. Xiao En was locked up in that small courtyard. This was the information that the 4th Bureau of the Overwatch Council had expended a great deal of effort to find out. But tonight, only Shang Shanhu's men had made their move. Yan Bingyun's children had already returned to the darkness. It was unknown whether or not Xinyang would send any aces to help. To rescue a prisoner in Shangjing was a violation of the laws of heaven. Regardless of whether or not he succeeded, the relationship between the royal family of Northern Qi and the military was on the verge of breaking. Thinking of this, Fan Xian, who was lying on the branch like a koala, couldn't help but feel great admiration for a certain noble in the south. Although the eldest princess was a crazy woman, she was indeed a very powerful crazy woman. From the day she turned around and sold out Yan Bingyun, it seemed that she had calculated all the changes that followed. No matter how they changed, the Qing court would receive great benefits. This woman was truly not simple. The night gradually deepened, and the courtyard under the tall tree was still quiet. In the distance, a baby was crying by the riverside. Nearby, an old horse was weakly chewing on hay. The stars in the sky were hidden behind the clouds. The leaves beside them ruffled in the night wind. This night seemed to be the same as every other night in Shangjing. There was nothing out of the ordinary. Without warning, Fan Xian, who was lying on the branch, opened his eyes and looked down at the courtyard. The prison break had begun. A carriage slowly drove up to the door of the small courtyard. At the same time, a small cart covered in grey cloth was quietly pushed up to the back wall of the courtyard. The defenses in the little courtyard did not seem to notice anything strange. Fan Xian, who was looking down on the world from high up in the tree, saw all of these actions clearly. A middle-aged man stepped out of the carriage. At the same time, Fan Xian noticed that a few black shadows had already disappeared around the courtyard. Who is it? The brocade guard responsible for guarding Xiao En was extremely vigilant. Half of his body peeked out from the wall. In his hand was a heavy crossbow, aimed at the middle-aged man standing at the door of the courtyard. The middle-aged man was Tan Wu, whom Fan Xian had met once before. He smiled and opened his mouth to speak. Suddenly, 2 black lights flashed, and 2 deadly crossbow bolts, one on the left and one on the right, ruthlessly pierced through the throat of the brocade guard. Blood splattered. The brocade guard's neck looked as if it had 2 iron rods attached to it. It looked incomparably bloody. Attack! Tan Wu gave the order in a quiet voice. What responded to him was a loud noise. A brawny man stepped out of the carriage. He was about 8 feet tall and held a large iron hammer in his hand. He strode to the door of the courtyard. The muscles in his right arm flexed, and he smashed down on the door of the courtyard. Looking at the power of his attack, the wooden door of the courtyard would immediately shatter into countless splinters of wood. There was a loud clang, deafening everyone present. Indeed, many splinters of wood flew everywhere, but the door did not break. Inside the wooden door, there was a layer of steel plate. High up in the tree, Fan Xian shivered. The place where the Northern Qi brocade guard imprisoned criminals was not as simple as it seemed. In an instant, the brocade guard in the courtyard had already reacted. They began to concentrate their men at the entrance of the courtyard. As the brawny man smashed down with his hammer, even the steel plate door began to creak and tremble. It seemed as if it could not withstand another few blows. A series of battle cries rang out, and a dozen or so black-clothed men climbed up the wall, clashing with the embroidered uniform guards inside. These black-clothed men's martial arts cultivation was not ordinary, but the most powerful thing about them was the murderous intent contained within their moves. Every move they made was accompanied by the power of wind and thunder, as if they were ready to risk their lives. These brocade guards, who had been guarding the bustling city of Shangjing for many years, were no match for these soldiers. Fresh blood covered the night, and they were quickly defeated. Fan Xian watched all of this coldly from the tree. He knew that Shang Shanhu's men were breaking down the door because Shaowen's legs had been crippled. He could not walk. He watched the brawny man smash the steel door like a laborer, and couldn't help but think to himself, "Smash the wall." He seemed to have forgotten that it was he who had ordered Shaowen's legs to be smashed. Chapter 234. The sound of a broken gong rang out. The steel plate that had been sandwiched in between the wooden planks had finally been smashed by the burly man. No one cheered. Not even the brocade guards in the courtyard cried out in alarm. The courtyard door fell with a creak, and the brocade guards, who had been prepared for this, shot through the air with their thin crossbows. It was extremely dangerous. The burly man's right arm had long since become numb from the dozen or so strikes, and the zhenqi in his body had been completely used up. Seeing the crossbow bolts flying towards him, he had no extra energy to react. There were countless chi-chi sounds as the crossbow bolts all pierced into his broad body. One of them pierced through his eye socket, and with a squeak, a bright red crystalline object shot out from his eye socket. Ah! Under the pain, the burly man let out a wild howl. Carrying the countless crossbow bolts on his body, he pounced into the courtyard. Every time he took a heavy step, a large amount of blood would spurt out of his body. He only took 3 steps forward before he fell to the stone floor like a small mountain. He smashed into the ground and kicked up a cloud of dust. The ground was covered in blood, but his presence made the embroidered uniform guards in the courtyard take 3 steps back. The dead burly man's body was extremely broad, so it blocked most of the crossbow bolts that were shot outside the courtyard. Using his body as cover, Tan Wu and the remaining experts floated in like a gust of wind. By the time the burly man's body pressed down on the brocade guards, everyone had already killed their way to the side of the brocade guards. At this time, the fighting on the high wall had also retreated into the courtyard. A dozen or so black-clothed men wielded Na-Maru short knives, which were rarely seen in Shangjing. They had actually forced the 20 or so brocade guards into a small circle that was less than 10 feet wide. The black-clothed men's attacks were extremely ruthless and harsh. Although they were outnumbered, the brocade guards had no way of defending themselves. The scene at this time was like a shark in the deep sea surrounding a large school of fish. The dense school of fish would always be torn apart, and blood would fall into the sharks' mouths. Not long after, the school of fish would be completely devoured. But Tan Wu could not wait. The general's adoptive father was still in the courtyard, and according to the news from the southerners, the palace had not been moved. Therefore, he waved his right hand and made a hand signal. 3 of the black-clothed men with the strongest martial arts separated themselves and charged into the building. Although there were 3 fewer people, the pressure the brocade guards felt did not lessen in the slightest. Between the flashes of swords and blades, there would occasionally be a splash of blood. Then, one of their comrades would have his arm cut off and his chest cut off, falling into a pool of blood on the ground. Fan Xian calmly observed the situation in the courtyard from his perch atop the tree. He knew that things were not so simple. The plan that Yan Bingyun had drafted had already received a response from Boss Shang. Shang Shanhu and Xinyang both thought that this sudden attack was a very good plan. In that case, Yan Bingyun must know what the brocade guard's backup plan was. Tan Wu also knew that things weren't that simple. It was a scream of pain after being injured, but it was also a warning. The 3 black-robed elites who had charged into the building earlier were sent flying out of the building. Blood gushed out of their mouths as they flew through the air. It was obvious just how powerful the elites from the embroidered uniform guards who had been lying in ambush in the building were. Tan Wu's expression did not change. The tips of his feet pushed off the blue stone floor, and his entire body leaped into the air. In an extremely short amount of time, he exchanged 3 blows with the man who had charged out of the building. 3 crisp sounds rang out. Deputy Commander Xiao, I did not expect you to personally be here watching the defense. Tan Wu looked coldly at the black-clothed man in front of him. He was one of the few aces in the Brocade Guard, Deputy Commander of the Discipline Commission, Xiao Yuanbing. This man's eyes were deep and bright. He looked coldly at Tan Wu and said, "The Empress Dowager knows that you rebels and traitors will come to make trouble. I will personally stand guard here and see who can rescue this prisoner." This Deputy Commander Xiao spoke with great confidence. Tan Wu covered his mouth and coughed twice, spitting out a few drops of blood. He was no match for his opponent, but there was not a trace of panic in his eyes. Instead, he narrowed his eyes and looked at the back of the courtyard. Fan Xian, who was on the tall tree, was no longer paying attention to the fight in the front yard. Instead, he looked at the small cot at the back of the courtyard. At this moment, the small cart was pressed tightly against the stone wall at the back of the courtyard. The wall looked ordinary, but it was incomparably sturdy. A very soft hissing sound rang out. Deputy Commander Xiao frowned slightly. With a palm strike, he pushed back Tan Wu, who had rushed forward to attack, and turned his head to look at the back of the building. Fan Xian carefully adjusted his posture, ready to go down the tree at any time. Looking at the small cart, he gently opened his mouth and spat out a single word soundlessly. "Explode!" An earth-shattering explosion rang out in that instant. The small cart had exploded for some unknown reason. Like a bolt of lightning, it blasted a large hole in the stone wall at the back of the courtyard. Stone fragments flew out like arrows, and in an instant, the 30 brocade guards lying in ambush at the back of the wall exploded into bloody corpses. This was the greatest sincerity that the Overwatch Council had shown to Shang Shanhu. A cart of secret explosives from the 3rd Bureau had finally come into play. Of course, this was something that Fan Xian had arranged, but he hadn't expected the 3rd Bureau to be so sincere. He couldn't help but feel some lingering fear. Don't be afraid that Xiao En, who was in the building, would be blown to death. As the stone fragments fell to the ground, there was a rustling sound. A jet-black carriage fearlessly drove up to the gap in the back wall. A few people rushed into the courtyard, braving the falling stones and dust that covered the street. Not long after, these people ran out of the gap, carrying a person who couldn't move easily. They got on the carriage and rushed to the mouth of the alley in the distance. From afar, the person on the back could be seen. His hair was white and unkempt. It was Xiao En. But strangely, Fan Xian slightly narrowed his eyes, but didn't go down the tree to follow. At the back wall, the valiant carriage disappeared into the night, leaving behind only the clattering of hooves and the sound of the wheels rolling over the stone road, echoing in the silence of Shangjing. Deputy Commander Xiao was held up by Tan Wu's fearless tactics, and had no time to pay attention to the shocking changes at the back wall. Today, Shang Shanhu's faction had stormed the front gate, but they had secretly ambushed the rear wall. The entire defensive strength of the small courtyard had been drawn to the front yard. Deputy Commander Xiao had carefully placed 30 brocade guard machete men in ambush at the rear wall. But no one expected that after that loud bang, the expected sounds of fighting did not ring out as they had expected. Thinking of that loud noise, Deputy Commander Xiao couldn't help but feel his heart palpitate. That kind of noise shouldn't be human. Could it be the wrath of the gods? Thinking of this, his hands gradually slowed down. Taking advantage of this opportunity, Tan Wu roared and rushed forward with his fist. His whole body was forced to retreat. After paying the price of the lives of a few of his subordinates, the remaining 8 or 9 men in black had already killed their way out of the courtyard, ready to disappear into the night. Ta 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 ta. Unexpectedly, the carriage that had disappeared into the night, for some unknown reason, actually came back at high speed. Tan Wu was shocked and led a group of men in black back. They met up with the carriage at the fork in the road south of the courtyard. He shouted, "Why didn't you leave?" The carriage was full of broken marks. It was obvious that it hadn't been made by stones, but by some long-range weapon. The good soldier sitting in the driver's seat had a look of despair on his face. He said in a hoarse voice, "General, we've been ambushed." After saying this, the man released his left hand from the terrible wound on his chest. His head tilted and he fell to his seat, unable to get up again. The horse pulling the carriage was lucky enough to not be injured, but it seemed to sense the death of its master and kicked its hind legs uneasily. The slow clatter of the horse's hooves rang out again, as if to echo the lonely sound of the horse's hooves. The clatter of the close-knit alleys around the courtyard began to ring out. The sound grew closer and closer, more and more frequent. In the pitch-black night, the stars in the sky seemed to be startled, and scattered down a bit of light, allowing everyone to clearly see where the sound of the horses' hooves was coming from. Countless brocade guards silently surged out of the alleys from all directions, and among them were soldiers from the Shangjing government. The sound of the horses' hooves rang out, and the solemn ambushers surrounded the lonely carriage and the 9 men in black next to it. Wherever their spears pointed, there wasn't a gap to escape. Capture them. The brocade guards parted. The provost of the Discipline Commission of the Brocade Guard, Shen Zhong, smiled and said, "General Shang Shanhu has given me this opportunity. Many thanks, many thanks." Failing to rescue the prisoners, Shen Zhong had finally found a chance to bring down Shang Shanhu. Given the current situation, he could not help but be happy. There was no despair on Tan Wu's face, nor was there shock. There was only incomparable anger and resentment. In the plan to rescue the prisoners tonight, he had already thought about what would happen if they failed. As one of Shang Shanhu's personal soldiers, he had no thoughts of cherishing his life. But Tan Wu was still very angry. In the plan, he knew that Shen Zhong might have an ambush, and his side had already prepared for it. For example, the residential buildings in the direction of the carriage should have been on fire by now, but it was still quiet. For example, the alleys where the brocade guards were lying in ambush should have been chaotic, but today there was not a single movement. Fan Xian was mixed in with the tree branches, calmly watching the situation in the distance. He looked at Tan Wu, who was as angry as a wounded eagle, without a trace of expression. In the plan, Shang Shanhu's side would be the main attack, and the task of covering the retreat should have been carried out by the spies from Xinyang and the Overwatch Council in Shangjing. But the eldest princess did not move, Yan Bingyun did not move, and Fan Xian did not move either. Compared to Shang Shanhu's northern soldiers, the Qing people, without a doubt, were quite consistent in their sinister and tacit understanding. Chapter 235. In the autumn of the 5th year of Tian Bao, the young emperor promised Shang Shanhu in a secret letter, "I will bring Xiaowen back to the empire." So Shang Shanhu abandoned the northern stronghold he had run for decades, and returned to Shangjing with only Tan Wu and his bodyguards. He believed that the emperor never went back on his word. Xiaowen returned to the empire, but the emperor refused to release him, because he wanted to know Xiaowen's secret. At the same time, the Empress Dowager wanted Xiaowen dead, because he did not want Xiaowen's secret to be known by anyone. Because the brocade guard kept a close eye on him, Shang Shanhu did not have any powerful allies in the capital. But because of his reputation in the army, both the Empress Dowager and the emperor had to give him face, and did not dare to push him too far. This was a situation that the northern Qi royal palace did not want to see. So if they could find an opportunity to weaken Shang Shanhu's power or reputation, they had to seize it. Like today. Shen Zhong looked at Tan Wu beside the carriage. He knew that after this incident, even if he could not convict Shang Shanhu, as long as he captured Shang Shanhu, his former personal guard, he believed that Shang Shanhu's reputation in the military would suffer a fatal blow. Colluding with the Qing kingdom was a crime that no soldier could bear. At that moment, Tan Wu tilted his head and opened his mouth to curse. "Damn the Qing kingdom." Shen Zhong smiled. "I heard that loud noise earlier." Aside from the Third Bureau of the Qing Kingdom's Overwatch Council, who else could come up with something like this? The Qing Kingdom helped General Tan break out of prison. This matter is settled. Unexpectedly, Tan Wu completely ignored him. He only turned his head to look at the 9 subordinates behind him. He had personally trained the commander's personal guards, and many of them had already died tonight. If it weren't for the Qing people's treachery, he would certainly have been able to lead them out of here alive. He turned his head to look at Shen Zhong, and suddenly bowed. "Master Shen Zhong, please pass on a message." "What message?" Shen Zhong did not press the issue, because he still held the hope that he could capture him alive. "The one who killed me is Fan Xian." Tan Wu was the commander's confidant, so he naturally knew who was involved in the plan. Fan Xian was the commissioner of the Overwatch Council and happened to be in Shangjing, so his role in it was obvious. The name, Fan Xian, came out of his mouth, filled with resentment and hatred. It was clearly transmitted into the ears of the hundreds of people present. Up in the tree, Fan Xian's face was calm, as if he hadn't heard anything. He knew that Shang Shanhu would eventually realize that he had played a dishonorable role in all of this. What's more, Tan Wu had roared before he died. As soon as he finished speaking, Tan Wu flipped his wrist and a snow-white saber light slashed upwards, slicing off his own cheek. The saber light turned again and slashed across his neck. His head fell to the ground. Immediately after, 9 swishing sounds rang out at the same time. 9 heads were washed away from the black-robed man's body by the blood, rolling onto the ground. They rolled together with Tan Wu's glaring, bloodied, and incomparably miserable faceless head. Strangely, Shen Zhong did not stop them from committing suicide. He only watched coldly. After a while he said softly, "These were all brave warriors of the nation. It is a pity that they were killed by the Qing people. Everyone, give them a proper burial." As Tan Wu killed himself, Fan Xian's heart trembled slightly. With his exceptional hearing, he heard Shen Zhong's words. Only then did he realize that Shen Zhong was not a simple man. All of the people who had tried to break out of the prison were dead. Only the lonely carriage remained, surrounded by the brocade guard. Everyone knew that the ancestor of the brocade guard, Xiao En, was in the carriage. He was no longer as brave as he was in the past. Without any warning, the carriage suddenly burst into flames. It was unknown what was attached to it. The fire was so strong that it enveloped the entire carriage in a moment. The horses in front were startled, but they could not make a sound. They continued to charge forward with the carriage in their mouths. There was a flash of saber light, and 2 horses fell to the ground with a thud. Their heads were bleeding profusely. Shen Zhong looked coldly at the burning carriage. No one knew what he was thinking. Deputy Commander Xiao looked at Fan Xian and said anxiously, "Sir, quickly put out the fire. His Majesty wants Xiao En alive." Shen Zhong smiled and waved his hand, stopping his subordinates from putting out the fire. He motioned for Deputy Commander Xiao to come in front of him. "But the Empress Dowager wants Xiao En dead," he said quietly. Deputy Commander Zhao's expression froze. He knew that what he had said earlier was a bit impulsive. He then noticed that a strange feeling had appeared in the corners of Shen Zhong's eyes. He heard Fan Xian quietly say to himself, "After being locked up for so many years, since I can't escape, death may not be a bad choice." The flames soared into the sky. In a short while, the carriage had been burnt to a crisp and fell into the street. Black ash rose, and the heat was suffocating. As soon as the fire stopped, a brocade guard coroner stepped forward and began to carefully examine the corpse in the carriage. Not long after, he reported, "It is indeed Xiao En." Shen Zhong nodded. "The leg injury is new?" "Yes." "The injury was not more than 2 months old." "Tooth?" "It is the same as what was recorded at Wudu. There are 3 missing teeth." Shen Zhong's expression was a bit strange, as if he could not believe that Xiaoan had died. It was as if he did not know how to express his feelings. In short, his smile was a bit strange, and a bit indifferent. In the southern part of the city, in the residence of General Shang Shanhu, a famous general, was talking to his wife. There was a list of gifts on the tea table next to them. Sounds of conversation could be faintly heard in the courtyard. His wife looked worried. "Master, it is the Empress Dowager's birthday. You cannot leave the capital for a few days. What should we do?" In the past, the general's residence would have been quiet at this time, but for some reason, even his wife was not asleep. Shang Shanhu's expression did not change. "Of course I cannot leave," he said in a low voice. "Then the birthday gift." The wife lowered her head and asked for instructions. "Of course I cannot prepare it. Madam, you should prepare your luggage." As they spoke, a stocky man suddenly strode into the back hall. The wife recognized this man as the marshal's personal attendant, but it was already early in the morning, and he had entered without an invitation. She thought that her inauspicious guess had come true. She looked at Shang Shanhu in a panic and said in a trembling voice, "You really did it?" Shang Shanhu was not angry, but his black silkworm eyebrows gradually became sharp as swords. In a low voice he said, "I am loyal to the court, but if there is something I cannot do, you must allow me to be impudent." The wife did not say anything more. She only silently retreated to the back room, no longer in the mood to take care of the Empress Dowager's birthday gift. "Marshal, there are more spies outside the residence." Only those who were closest to Shang Shanhu would stubbornly address him as "Commander," instead of Great General. The personal attendant who spoke had no surname. He was an orphan who had been picked up by Shang Shanhu from the snowy forest and raised to this age. He was given the surname Shang Shanhu, and his name was a single character, Pa. His relationship with Shang Shanhu was similar to the relationship between Shang Shanhu and Xiao En, except that he respected Shang Shanhu more than he respected him. Wait for the news. Shang Shanhu sat calmly in his chair. His face was calm, and not a trace of nervousness could be seen. Shang Shanpa accepted the order and left to monitor the movements outside the courtyard. At the same time, he prepared the follow-up measures. After a long time, Shang Shanpa once again returned to the back room. He half knelt on the ground and said in a low voice, "It has failed." His voice did not tremble in the slightest, but for some reason, it was impossible to conceal the sorrow that seeped through. Shang Shanhu's right hand, which was resting on the armrest of the chair, paused. He closed his eyes with great force, and the wrinkles at the corners of his eyes bloomed like chrysanthemums. It was only now that the true age of this famous general was revealed. He walked back to the back room and looked at his wife, who was sitting uneasily by the bed. He smiled and said, "It's already very late. Why aren't you asleep?" The general's wife smiled uneasily. "I can't sleep." Shang Shanhu smiled and said, "We won't leave the capital. Let's discuss the gift list for the Empress Dowager when we enter the palace in a few days." At this time, the sky was at its darkest before dawn. The messy courtyard below began to be cleaned up, and the 400 brocade guards who had surrounded the area also began to silently disperse according to their duties. The charred carriage and the corpses on the ground had also been taken over by the professionals of the Discipline Commission. In a short while, the area below had returned to peace. In the face of the powerful machinery of the empire, it was not impossible to cover up such an earth-shattering event. The injured brocade guards were still lying on the ground by the back wall. Occasionally, they would let out a few muffled cries of pain. The damage caused by the explosion had been severe. Most of them had died. Even those who had escaped were covered in dust and blood. At this moment, there were people carrying the injured brocade guards towards the yamen in the direction of the northern part of the city. The physicians were also nervously following behind them. The long line of stretchers looked like a thin centipede, twisting their waists as they moved forward. Fan Xian carefully crouched on a tree branch. He tightened his muscles, then relaxed them again. He repeated this process over and over again, so that his reflexes would not slow down if he stood still for too long. He looked at the injured people on the stretchers in the alley under the tree. He thought to himself, "If it weren't for the fact that I loved watching the Silence of the Lambs and Leon the Assassin, I'm afraid I would have let that old man escape." Chapter 236. The battlefield under the tree had quieted down. The brocade guard had used carriages to transport a lot of water from the Yuchuan River. With a tilt of the bucket, the clear water splashed onto the street. In a flash, the dust and blood on the ground were washed away, leaving only the wet, clean stone slabs. There were brocade guards keeping watch all around, and there were also related yamens conducting surveillance in the various houses, so there were no unusual movements around the T-shaped alley. The stone wall at the back of the courtyard was also beginning to be temporarily sealed up. In short, the Discipline Commission had to restore this area to its original state as quickly as possible. The palace did not want to bring up this matter at this time. After all, Tan Wu and the others had died a heroic death. It would be difficult to frame Shang Shanhu, and after all, they had to consider the military's attitude, so they were prepared to keep it under wraps for a while. The morning birds chirped. The brocade guards raised their heads and looked at the sky, which had not yet brightened. They thought to themselves that the birds had woken up early. Did they know what had happened here? Hiding under the tree, Fan Xian wiped away a drop of cold sweat from his forehead. He cussed the sleepless birds in his heart. He carefully hid his figure in the darkness before dawn, following the wounded brocade guards from a distance as they made their way north of the city. There were no pedestrians on the long street, and there was no rustling of street sweepers from his previous life. He leaped across the two-story buildings on the neighboring street, confident that no one would discover his tracks. The stretcher-bearers were already far away from the small courtyard and had entered another, but he didn't know if it was the Discipline Commission or the 13 yamens. The wounded were separated into different rooms, waiting for treatment. A few bloodied doctors hurried in and out. Fan Xian circled around to the back and waited behind a few bamboo baskets in the corner. Not long after, a few muffled grunts came from a side room. The sound was very soft, but it clearly reached his ears. After a few breaths, a person climbed down from the wall. His movements were slow, and after landing on the ground, he carefully tidied up his clothes and confirmed his identity token. Only then did he step forward and walk toward West Street. Fan Xian saw that the person was wearing the uniform of the brocade guards. Although the man wore his hat tightly, a few strands of white hair still flew out. As he slowly walked, the white hair trembled slightly, looking extremely miserable in the night wind. Watching the man walk further and further away, Fan Xian's eyes, which were not covered by his hat, shone with a cold light. He noticed that the way the man walked was a little strange, and knew that his old comrade's legs had not healed after he had broken them. He followed, and the two of them walked along the quiet street to the west. Although there were guards at every intersection, Xueqi was dressed in the uniform of the brocade guard, and he had killed people in the side rooms to steal their tokens. This allowed him to pass through several checkpoints without any mishaps. Fan Xian was like a ghost disappearing into the night. Following from a distance, he easily passed through a few trials. On the way, Xueqi took a break at an ordinary person's house. Behind them, on the roof of an ordinary house, Fan Xian also rested for a while. Then, the two of them stood up one after the other. Before the sky brightened, they crawled out of the net the embroidered uniform guards had woven and arrived at the western city gate. After the city gate was opened, the vegetable farmers who had been waiting outside for almost an hour each handed over the travel documents that had been prepared by the officials in the city, and rushed in. And Xueqi also took advantage of this chaos to sneak out of the high city gate. After a while, the old man, who had survived a calamity, had already made his way with difficulty to the foot of Mount Yan, west of Shangjing, next to the disorderly forest. Fan Xian followed from afar, his extremely sharp eyes staring in the direction of the old comrade's advance. After a while, Xueqi emerged from the forest. He was dressed in tattered clothes, and the corners of his clothes were stained with the black soot of an old man in the village. He had gathered so much firewood from who knew where, and carried it on his back like a small mountain. The sun had already risen from the east, illuminating the quiet mountain forest. In a flash, it dispersed the mist, and the air was clear. Anyone who saw that old man would think of him as a hard-working old farmer, who had risen in the morning to gather firewood. No one would associate him with the famous spy chief of 20 years ago. Fan Xian stood quietly in the tree, coldly watching Xueqi's hunched body as he slowly advanced. A chill welled up in his heart. After all, Xueqi was old. Not only was his body not as good as it had been, but even his mind was a bit slow. Who would choose to come out to gather firewood at this time of the day? The real farmers would only enter the mountains at dusk to collect firewood. It was quiet outside the city, and it was also quiet inside the city. The spy of the embroidered uniform guard reported, "The Qing diplomatic mission is very quiet. It is said that Master Lin Wen arranged for 2 singers to accompany Envoy Fan yesterday. They didn't sleep much last night." "Are you sure Fan Xian is in the diplomatic mission?" Xin Zhong had already taken off his official robes and changed into his rich man's clothes. He held a piece of roasted donkey meat in his right hand and brought it to his mouth. "Yes, sir," the spy replied respectfully. "Some of our brothers know what Fan Xian looks like, and they have been watching from outside the courtyard." Shen Zhong was slightly taken aback. He tossed the greasy donkey meat onto the table. His eyes were slightly sunken, and he appeared particularly listless. After a night of torment, no one's body was made of iron. Suddenly, he laughed and said, "How could that be an honest person? Has Friar he already left?" "Yes." The spy suddenly became spirited. "Master Lang Tiao has also gone." Shen Zhong slowly closed his eyes. No one knew what he was thinking. After a while he quietly said to himself, "These southern barbarians want us to think that Fan Xian is still in the diplomatic mission. If we kill Fan Xian now, won't they suffer a loss?" He opened his eyes, which were as ruthless as an eagle's. "These southern barbarians have learned to scheme over the past decade. I'm afraid their cleverness will make them fall victim to it." After a night of watching, Fan Xian also felt a little tired. But the tyrannical Xueqi in his body was incomparably abundant, so he could still manage. Looking at the old man on the forest path in the distance, who had difficulty even walking. He couldn't help but feel some admiration. He was already 70 or 80 years old, and after decades of torment, he had actually managed to escape from prison so thoroughly. Fan Xian didn't know where this old man got his mental strength from. Fan Xian didn't move, because he always felt that some unknown danger was waiting for him. And Xiaowen's exit from the city seemed a little too smooth. Suddenly, he thought of a certain possibility. He narrowed his eyes, slid down the tree, and retreated in the opposite direction. In a flash, he disappeared to who knew where. The sun moved westward inch by inch, and Xiaowen moved westward inch by inch. To the west was the western sky. It could be death or it could be pure land. Naturally, the diplomatic mission in Xinjiang wouldn't report all their plans to Shanhu, and Xiaowen also had other plans. The mountain path went up and up, until it came to an end. On the edge of a cliff was a hill overgrown with shallow grass. To the left was a stone road that led to the Shangjing army's horse camp. This was where Shanhu and Xiaowen had agreed to meet up. The faint red light in Xiaowen's eyes had already dimmed. He tilted his shoulder slightly, letting the small mountain of wet firewood fall to the ground. He patted his butt and sat down. Since there was no one to meet up with him, this plan must have been discovered by the Qi Kingdom's palace. Needless to say, someone must be waiting for him here. Just like that time on the meadow by Wudu, Xiaowen once again felt tired. He didn't want to go any further. "Come out." His slightly dry lips opened and closed, and he spat out a few words. As soon as he spoke, the grass trembled. A black-robed swordsman slowly walked out from the end of the mountain path. This swordsman had a very high forehead, and his face was very pale. His brows and eyes seemed to have weathered the vicissitudes of life. He was about 40 years old, and his right hand rested firmly on the hilt of his sword. His knuckles protruded from between his fingers. His entire person was like a cold sword. Friar He. Xiaowen's eyes narrowed, and a cold light shone from them. This swordsman was Friar He, one of the few 9th-level aces in northern Qi. The 8th-level Chang Jushu that Fan Xian had killed a year and a half ago on the street of Nyolan was his disciple. Friar He's face was pale, and his black robes contrasted with each other like charcoal. He gripped the hilt of his sword with utmost respect, raised it upside down, and cupped his fists in salute. "Greetings, Mr. Xiao." In northern Qi, except for Ku He, everyone else could only greet Xiaowen with the respect of a junior. Who would have thought that the young swordsman of yesteryear would now become the most powerful swordsman of the Brocade Guard? Xiaowen coughed, still sitting on the ground, and gently massaged his knees. "It's been many years." Friar He looked at Xiaowen, his face full of sincere respect. "I am not a dog of the Brocade Guard. I am a follower of the Empress Dowager. Today, I have come to ask Mr. Xiao to rest in peace." Xiaowen said softly, "You must know that this world belongs to His Majesty." Friar He knew what this old man meant. The Emperor did not want to kill Xiaowen, and by standing on the side of the Empress Dowager, he would undoubtedly offend the young Emperor. He smiled and looked around. "I had thought that I would see that young talent of the Fan dynasty today." Xiaowen coughed again. "Who would have thought that after running amok for so long, I would die as bait?" "Old sir, there is no need to grieve. Since that Fan Xian has retreated, he is lucky." With a swish, Friar He unsheathed his sword and flew forward like a bird. His wrist, elbow and shoulder formed a straight line as he stabbed towards Xiaowen's heart. Chapter 237. The tip of the sword plunged into Xiaowen's left shoulder, and he pulled it out in a split second, drawing out a spray of blood. However, the flower was not particularly beautiful. Xiaowen's old body seemed to have much less blood in it than a young man's. With a dull thud, Friar He held his sword across his chest and retreated. Xiaowen sat on the ground, holding a branch as thick as a forearm in his withered right hand. When Friar He thrust his sword earlier, the old man had used some unknown technique to disregard his left shoulder and strike Friar He's shin with a branch from an impossible angle. The tip of the branch in his hand had been smashed to smithereens, a testament to the strength of the blow. Friar He felt a sharp pain in his left leg, and his already pale face turned even whiter. His right hand still held the hilt of his sword steadily, but his left leg, which had been struck by the tree branch, began to tremble. He had thought that, with his 9th-level strength, it would be easy for him to kill a weary old man covered in old wounds. Even though he knew that his opponent was Xiao En, the terrifying Xiao En he had known all those years ago, he had made ample preparations. But he still did not expect the old man to be so unpredictable and strange. Xiao En coughed and said, "My leg was broken by that fan kid, so I had to hit your leg first. Even if I couldn't break it." Before Xiao En could finish speaking, Friar he swung his sword again. His sword was like a swimming dragon, circling around Xiao En, who was trapped on the ground. He had long since let go of any thoughts of underestimating his opponent. Instead, he carefully dealt with him as if he were facing a grandmaster. Friar He's swordsmanship was completely different from the common schools of thought in the world. It was said that he had inherited it from a certain barbarian in the north of the mountains, and was as fierce as a swimming dragon. Occasionally, it would be diluted, but it was in harmony with the natural principles of Xueqi's lineage. It was said that after he had completed his swordsmanship, he had once asked Xueqi for advice and had benefited greatly. At this time, Xiao En only had a wooden stick in his hand. It was difficult for him to move, and he was trapped. Even so, the branch in Xiao En's hand was like the tongue of a viper, flicking and flicking around his body. Occasionally, it would stab out horizontally with a strange edge, forcing Friar He to retreat. But Friar He's true chi gradually rose, and sword light enveloped his body. The air began to buzz, and Xiao En's wooden stick was no match for him. The sword and the staff clashed, and the branch in Xiao En's hand immediately became countless pieces of wood floating in the air. Xiao En stretched out his hand and casually picked up a branch. He thrust it diagonally to the right, breaking Friar He's soul-chasing sword. He came from the mountains with a bundle of firewood, but the wet twigs would run out sooner or later. After an unknown period of time, the heat of the summer gradually rose at the end of the mountain road, and the sun began to spread its sinister rays. Xiao En's tattered clothes were riddled with narrow gashes, from which blood was seeping out. There were a few deep wounds on his chest, and one could even see the flesh torn by the sword aura. However, the old man had lost too much blood, so the wounds were pale. Around his body, there was a layer of densely packed mosquito wings and limbs. These insects that did not know life or death had smelled the blood, but in a moment, they were sucked into the sword chi true power, and turned into dust. 5 steps in front of Xiao En, Friar He stood, sword in hand. His pale face was tinged with blood, and his right hand, which held the hilt of his sword, finally showed signs of trembling. He hadn't had it easy either. His black shirt had long since been chopped into a mess by the wet twigs around Xiao En. His body was covered in wounds, and even more frightening were the fresh twigs and stubble around them. "Come out. That fan kid won't come." Friar He swallowed. He hadn't expected the old man's desire to live to be so strong. But seeing that Xiao En was about to die, and that the expected southern chi man still hadn't made a move, he couldn't help but call out to his companions. Xiao En's eyelids fluttered, and he glanced at the enemy who had been hiding nearby. He called out to these juniors. "Isn't that a little disrespectful?" The man approached in silence, holding a curved knife in each hand. What was particularly frightening about the blades were the many thin steel spikes that looked like the wounds on Friar He's body. He silently bowed to Xiao En. Sister Haitang escorted Mr. Xiao back to the capital. "Because of His Majesty's strict orders, we could not attack. Today, Mr. Xiao escaped from prison, and I had no choice but to act. Please forgive me, Mr." Xiao En laughed coldly. He's disciples have indeed learned his way of scaring people. On the surface, they appear to be benevolent and righteous, but secretly they are evil and treacherous. They're just looking for an excuse to kill me. Why make it sound so innocent? This man was He's first disciple, the emperor's martial arts teacher, Lang Tiao. Seeing that Xiao En was insulting his teacher, he didn't say anything more. He crossed his wrists, and the 2 curved knives in his hands became 2 balls of black light, flying toward Xiao En's head. Xiao En suddenly let out a wild roar. The pure inner strength he had cultivated for nearly 50 years finally exploded. He pushed out his palms, attacking Lang Tiao's knives from an impossible angle. The wind from his palms was swift and fierce. If Xiao En's palms killed him, Lang Tiao's wrists would immediately be shattered. Lang Tiao was silent, but he twisted his wrists, and the 2 sharp curved knives in his hands spun back in a strange way. The backs of the knives struck the back of Xiao En's hands. 2 sounds rang out at the same time. The back of Xiaowen's hands was instantly sliced by the steel spikes on the two curved knives, but at the same time, Xiaowen's palms had also reached in. Lang Tiao was still expressionless. He let go of the hilts of his knives and pushed out with both palms. After a light sound, the two palms, who were 30 years apart in age, fiercely struck each other. There was nothing fancy about this. It was purely a contest of strength. As Ku He's first disciple, Lang Tiao's spirit was at its peak. Xiaowen, on the other hand, had been imprisoned for many years and had suffered all sorts of suffering. He was no longer as brave as he had been in the past. In comparison, Lang Tiao had the upper hand. With a swish, Lang Tiao pushed Xiaowen back. With a flick of his wrist, the knives glowed even brighter, slashing toward Xiaowen's shoulders. The two curved knives in his hands had a thin chain tied to his wrists. The two knives glowed as they flew toward Xiaowen, reflecting the red sun high up in the sky. It was a terrifying sight. The dying Xiaowen suddenly found strength from somewhere. His eyes rolled up, and his middle finger bent slightly. He raised it toward the sky, blocking the lower edges of Lang Tiao's powerless hands. At this moment, countless gusts of wind rose up. A figure, like a gray dragon, soared into the sky from the grass, directly attacking the two combatants. Friar He had been standing with his sword, waiting for this moment. He had been waiting for Fan Xian to come out. He gripped his sword with both hands. He had been accumulating power for a long time. From head to toe, he chopped down vertically, without any extra tricks. There was a hissing sound. Even the air seemed to be cut open by the sword, let alone the person who was charging at him at high speed. But Friar He didn't know that the person he wanted to kill was one of the most skilled dodging figures in the world. He only saw the figure twist in the air in a strange manner. Without any leverage, like a shadow, he dodged the attack. As the old saying goes, the more Wu Zhu fights, the harder it is for Fan Xian to get hit. The sword struck empty air. Friar He's chest tightened, and the countless sounds of breaking air arrived in front of him. He valiantly pulled back his sword and made 3 horizontal slashes, knocking down most of the hidden weapons. When the hidden weapons fell to the ground, he realized they were just gravel. He forcefully pulled back his sword. His blood was shaken, and he couldn't help but spit out a mouthful of blood. He forcefully swallowed it. As his body froze, 3 beams of black light shot down from the top of his head. The two of them were too close. Friar He turned his wrist, and the tip of his sword accurately knocked away the 3 beams of black light. But the last strike was not strong enough, and his Xueqi paused. Although the crossbow bolt had received some force, its direction did not change too much. It brushed past his thigh and stabbed into the grass. That was close. Friar He finally realized how difficult it was to deal with Fan Xian. He turned his head in shock. Fan Xian had forcefully turned around in the air, avoiding Friar He's long-awaited strike. He had paid a heavy price for it. Even though his meridians were much wider than the average martial cultivator's, he still couldn't stop his blood rushing. His Xueqi felt like it was being torn apart, colliding with his meridians. He didn't have the dignity of a martial artist. Still in the air, he spat out a mouthful of blood, looking wretched and wretched. But in a flash, his meridians were cleared. At that moment, Lang Tiao's terrifying twin blades had already sunk deep into Xiaowen's shoulders. Fan Xian let out a strange cry. Still in the air, he had already pulled out half of the long blade from his back and swung it at the back of Lang Tiao's head. Lang Tiao seemed to have eyes in the back of his head. With a swish, he pulled back his blade. The tip of the curved blade struck Fan Xian's hilt half a foot, the weakest point of the blade. With a clang, the other half of the long knife in Fan Xian's hand broke again, but the pitiful remaining part of the knife still chopped down brutally. Ding, 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 ding. It swept away all the steel spikes on the curved knife in Lang Tiao's hand. In that instant, Fan Xian abandoned his blade, circulated his qi, and punched out. 2 of his best black fists transformed into 2 dragons, striking at Lang Tiao's temples. He didn't care that the tip of his opponent's blade was aimed at his lower abdomen. He knew that against an expert of this level, he had to be steady, accurate, and ruthless. He had to leave no way out for himself, and no way out for his opponent. Lang Tiao suddenly turned his head, a cold light flashing in his eyes. He crossed his palms and sealed Fan Xian's fists. Their energies intersected. The tyrannical Xueqi of the nameless martial secrets and the Tianyi Xueqi of Ku he finally met. Chapter 238. On the short grass on the side of the cliff, there was an earth-shattering sound. Fan Xian's body was in midair and had the advantage of the heavens. Lang Tiao's feet were on the ground and he borrowed the strength of the terrain. The two vast waves of Xueqi collided together. Even the grass around the two of them was crushed to dust. Lang Tiao grunted and swung the scimitar tied to his wrist backwards. With a squelch, it pierced into Xiaowen's chest. Although this was a double trap, if he couldn't kill Fan Xian, he had to kill Xiaowen first. This was something his teacher Xueqi had always kept an eye on. Fan Xian's palms were scorching hot. Lang Tiao's body turned, and the two scimitars sliced towards Fan Xian's chest like a windmill. The snow-splashing scimitars were coming for his soul. At this moment, Xiaowen was about to die, and Fan Xian could no longer escape. There was no longer any possibility of playing cat and mouse. So he gritted his teeth and did the riskiest thing he had done since his rebirth. Ignoring Lang Tiao's powerful scimitars, he reached out and grabbed Xiaowen by the collar. In the blink of an eye, he bent his knees slightly and raised his left calf. There was a crisp clang. This was clearly not the sound of a scimitar cutting into human flesh. Fan Xian grunted, flipped over Lang Tiao's head, and flicked a finger with his left hand. This was a small trick. Lang Tiao's earlobe hurt slightly, and his eyebrows flew up. Fan Xian's calf felt as if it had been struck by lightning. It was incomparably painful, but he used the power of the scimitar to grab hold of Xiaowen. His uninjured right foot touched the ground, and his whole body had already rushed forward, towards the empty area in front of him. He rushed towards the cliff, and then jumped down. Lang Tiao's expression was wooden, but he was shocked. Why did his scimitar feel like it had hit steel when it had landed on Fan Xian's leg? He had great confidence in the power of his scimitar. The secret of the round scimitar was enough to cut through metal. Even if his opponent was wearing armor, it would still be cut in half. How could Fan Xian have blocked it? He rushed to the edge of the cliff and looked out. The sun was getting brighter, but it still could not disperse the fog in the deep valley. They saw the old man and the young man fall into the fog and could no longer be seen. It was only after a long time that they heard the thud of a heavy object falling. The sound was very soft, but the cliff was very deep. The two of them could hear it even from the edge of the cliff, so they could imagine the intensity of the collision. "He fell to his death," said Friar He. Lang Tiao shook his head. "Xiaowen won't die easily. Fan Xian, I think it's even harder." Lang Tiao and Friar He were one of the few 9th-level masters in Shangjing City, and yet they were unable to kill Xiaowen, who was heavily injured, and Fan Xian, who had just entered the 9th level on the spot. This fact made the two masters shiver in fear. "We can't climb this mountain," Friar He said with a frown. Lang Tiao looked down. Yen Mountain's stone walls were as sharp as a knife and as smooth as a mirror. Not even the 4 transcending mortality and saintly grandmasters would be able to climb up, let alone a martial expert. So he nodded, tacitly agreeing with Taoist He's judgment. Inform Shen Zhong to search the foot of the mountain. After finishing their preparations, the two masters looked up at the misty cliffs. They thought of the previous battle and couldn't help but frown, but they were thinking in different directions. Why did Fan Xian risk his life to save Xiaowen? This was Friar He's question. Why did Fan Xian's strength far exceed little sister's assessment? This was Lang Tiao's question. Suddenly, Lang Tiao's eyes flashed coldly. With a flick of his wrist, the tip of his knife accurately sliced off a piece of flesh from his earlobe. Friar He had always trusted Xueqi's knowledge and ability. He frowned and looked down at his thigh, only to see the skin where the arrow had grazed. Although he wasn't injured, it was still slightly black. "That Fan kid is vicious," he said coldly. "Have you forgotten? Fan Xian's most famous skill in the Qing kingdom is called petty tricks," Lang Tiao said in a low voice. Although he said this, Lang Tiao was still thinking about the exchange earlier. The tyrannical Xueqi in Fan Xian's fists was truly strange. It was cold and had an invading intent. Its ruthlessness was more powerful than any kind of internal Xueqi in the world. What did one usually encounter when jumping off a cliff? Usually, one would encounter a master, a beautiful woman, a peerless secret manual, and limitless wealth. As Fan Xian jumped off the cliff, he thought that he was indeed carrying a master on his back, but if his calculated landing spot was a bit off, then he would have to say goodbye to the beautiful woman at home. As for the limitless wealth his mother had left behind, he naturally wouldn't have the chance to enjoy it. Speaking of that nameless peerless secret manual, he reckoned Uncle Wu Zhu would burn it for him. Although Uncle Wu Zhu's teaching ability was a bit lacking, he was a faithful executor of spoon-feeding education. Fan Xian reckoned that even if he went to the underworld, he wouldn't let him off lightly. Back in the day, Commander Zhu jumping off a cliff was Fan Xian's most amazing scene, so he often practiced jumping off cliffs. Even when he was on his honeymoon in the Tsong Mountains, he didn't let it go. Now, he finally had a little success, at least with a person on his back. He was able to accurately use the short pine trees between the smooth rock walls to slow down and find the spot he had chosen in advance, the slightly protruding rock. Fan Xian's legs landed on the rock, and the tyrannical Xueqi in his body reacted, bouncing out. But his left leg had suffered from Lang Tiao's frightening knife, and it was sore and powerless. With a grunt, he half-knelt on the ground. At that moment, he still didn't forget to sweep a large rock off the cliff. After a while, there was the sound of it falling to the ground. Are you stupid? There was a small hole behind the rock. It wasn't deep, and Xiao En, covered in wounds, was leaning against it. He looked at Fan Xian mockingly. Let's see how you get up there. Fan Xian shrugged. Of course, he wouldn't tell the dying old man his secret. He glanced at the hole and confirmed that it had nothing to do with Zhang, then fed Xiao En a pill. Xiao En didn't hold back. He swallowed the pill and looked at Fan Xian mockingly. If this was 20 years ago, how could Lang Tiao and Friar He, two juniors, be a match for me? But you? You are the commissioner of the Overwatch Council of the Kingdom of Qing, the successor of Chen Pingping and Fei Jie. But you were forced off a cliff by someone else, and now you can only wait to starve to death. Fan Xian didn't get angry. He smiled. When an old man likes to talk about the past, it's probably because he's about to die. Xiao En's expression didn't change. I was going to die anyway. After living for so many years, dying is not a loss. The problem is that you're still young. So I don't understand why you came to save me. He paused. But why did you dare to jump into the clouds? Your adopted son only knows how to fight. He doesn't know how to do these things. Fan Xian took out a thin needle from his hair and stuck it into Xiao En's body to staunch the bleeding. Even the brocade guard was able to find out where you met up, much less me. Of course I was prepared. Xiao En allowed him to use his medical skills. He rolled his eyes. Your needle is poisoned. Fan Xian wasn't amused. You're going to die anyway. You have hundreds of poisons in your body. What's one more? Xiao En coughed. His eyes dimmed. He was about to die, and even his temperament seemed a little strange. Fan Xian looked at the old man's pale face, which had lost too much blood. He suddenly asked, when Shen Zhong surrounded the courtyard, you should have known that Shang Shanhu's rescue operation was part of the brocade guard's plan. Why did you continue? Continue what? Continue pretending to be injured, and painstakingly run out of the city. You knew that there would be aces waiting for you, and that the people who came to your aid had long since been eliminated. Xiao En looked at him and suddenly let out a shrill laugh. Perhaps I was just following the intentions of those people. They wanted to lure you out, so that you could accompany me in death. Fan Xian shrugged. Let's talk about something serious. Xiao En's gaze easily passed over Fan Xian's shoulder, as if he were looking at an obstacle. He cast his gaze into the deep, quiet valley. The sun was getting stronger and stronger, and the clouds in front of the stone wall finally began to disperse. The mountain wall in front of him was like a cracked yellow mirror, with a different kind of beauty. Well, I've been locked up for a long time. So, even if I die, I don't want to die in prison, said Xiao En. Fan Xian followed his gaze and found that the mountain wall opposite him was extremely smooth. Occasionally, there were cracks that spread out in all directions like the lines of lightning. From far away, he could see an incomparably tenacious small tree growing, revealing its pitiful but respectable green color. There are green trees here, and there's green water and white fog below. It's a good grave. Fan Xian smiled and began to tidy up his left trouser leg. The Overwatch Council's clothes were made of fire, theft, and sharp weapons, but Lang Tiao's knife had shaken a hole in them. He took out the black, slender dagger that Fei Jie had left for him from his boots. Gently stroking the slightly deformed blade, he sighed. Thank you, but I don't want to change my name to Fan Ping Ping. Why did you act so stupidly, and throw yourself into a dead end? Xiaoen looked curiously at Fan Xian's disguised face. An ominous bloody froth seeped from the corners of his dry lips. Perhaps when a person was on the brink of death, their curiosity only grew stronger. Fan Xian placed the dagger by his feet and began to massage the meridians in his frozen calf. Calmly, he said, "When I discovered that this was an ambush by Northern Qi, I was indeed prepared to retreat. But seeing that you were about to die, I don't know why my brain suddenly broke, but I jumped out." In truth, the reason was simple. Fan Xian wanted to know Xiaoen's secret. He wanted to know where the temple was. He wanted to know the relationship between the temple and Yi Qingmei, and his own rebirth into this world. Between his own life and death, his past, and the ins and outs of his arrogant mother, Fan Xian, who had always cherished his life, could finally afford to be extravagant for once. Chapter 239. The sunlight in the valley seemed to have become tangible. Wherever it shone, the clouds rippled like blue waves disturbed by an oar. Most of the fog had dispersed, but there was still a wisp of smoke lingering in front of the precipice, passing through the scattered green trees. The top of the small cave protruded slightly, and the opposite cliff was very far away from the bottom of the valley. Even with Fan Xian's hearing, it would take him a long time before he could faintly hear the sounds coming from the bottom of the valley. Presumably, the brocade guards of Shangjing were searching for their bodies at the bottom of the valley. The bottom of the valley should be damp and gloomy. Fan Xian reckoned that after a while, they would know that Xiaoen and Fan Xian had not fallen off the mountain. Fan Xian guessed that the Northern Qi people would probably think that he and Xiaoen were lucky and search along the bottom of the valley. But he did not dare to underestimate Shen Zhong's ruthlessness. No one knew when they would turn their attention back to the mirror-like surface of the cliff. As for Lang Tiao, Fan Xian knew from their first encounter that this senior disciple of Haitang was indeed one of the most powerful men in the world. His mind was firm and determined, and he was not the kind of person who would be easily deceived. The mountain breeze stirred, and Xiaoen's pale face trembled slightly. The old man had already fallen into a semi-conscious state, and could die at any moment. The sun outside seemed unable to transmit any warmth to this old man who had forced his way to the mountains to meet his death. Fan Xian scratched his head and looked at Xiaoen's face. The old comrade's face was like a layer of orange peel that had been dipped in white pulp. He thought for a moment, then carefully took out the small blue pill from his belt. The pill gave off the faint smell of ephedra leaves, and had already been cut in half with a knife. Fan Xian crushed the remaining half and stuffed it into Xiaoen's mouth. Then he took out a water pipe from his sleeve and dripped water from a water bag hidden in his clothes onto Xiaoen's withered lips. After a while, the dying Xiaoen woke up. He opened his eyes, and the scarlet color that had faded reappeared in his pupils. The old man seemed to have regained some of his former power in the moment before his death. "What medicine did you feed me?" "A small blue pill." Fan Xian smiled and said, "It's to raise your spirits. However, it can't help you recover your former glory." Xiaoen naturally did not understand this joke. "You ate before you made your move, right?" Xiaoen's breathing became much more powerful, and his spirit gradually shook off the depression. If it wasn't the final radiance of the setting sun before death, then it meant that the drug had stimulated the remaining energy in the old man's body. Fan Xian did not immediately respond to his question. He stretched out his finger and felt Xiaoen's pulse. He found that it was gradually becoming stronger, but there was a slight dryness to it. He knew that the ephedra pill was beginning to take effect. But this primitive stimulant could raise Xiaoen's spirits for a moment, but it could not save his life. He took a deep breath, looked at Xiaoen calmly, and said, "Lang Tiao and Friar He, I broke your leg. Even if we join forces, we won't be a match for them, so I have to take some medicine. However, I'm a little curious as to why there are only 2 experts and not a large group of people waiting for us." Xiaoen coughed violently. The medicine was taking effect. He waved his hand with some difficulty. "They don't want to make a big deal out of this. If they can't hide it from the little emperor, there will be trouble in the future." Fan Xian looked at him and thought of the little emperor's reason for sparing his old life. It was the same reason as his own, but he did not continue on this topic. "You saved this old man for no other reason than the secret in this old man's heart." Xiaoen looked at the chirping birds in the valley, and a look of envy flashed in his eyes. "In the end, what is that secret?" The little emperor wants the temple's help to unite the world. Why do you want to go to the temple so badly? Of course I have my own reasons. Can you tell me about them? The two spies, one old and one young, were at different stages of history. At this moment, they were calmly chatting like children at the entrance of a village. Tell me a part of it. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes. He felt a little weak. The effects of the ephedra pill were about to fade, and his spirit was a little weary. I don't know if you believe it or not, but I live in this world. Most of the time, I am like a tourist. I want to go to all the interesting corners of this world, and the temple is without a doubt the place that interests me the most. Tourist. Shaoan used a pair of blood-red eyes to stare at Fan Xian's ordinary face in disguise. Fan Xian laughed. Is it strange? Heaven and earth are the travelers of all living things. Time is the traveler of 100 generations. Since you and I live in this great inn, we naturally want to see what is in every room of the inn. Perhaps there is a poisonous snake in the room at the end of the second floor. Shaoan moved back a little with difficulty. He felt the heat of life in his body. He knew that he was getting closer and closer to death, and subconsciously wanted to sit a little more comfortably. Perhaps it is a beautiful woman bathing in a wooden tub. Fan Xian laughed. Shaoan looked at the young man and gently shook his head. Curiosity killed the old cat. You actually risked your life to save me for such an absurd reason, and ended up in a dead end. Do you regret it now? Fan Xian turned his head to look at the unfathomably deep cliff. He sighed and said nothing. Are you stupid? This was the second time Shaoan had said this. He smiled. For a worthless secret, you buried your own life. Fan Xian laughed bitterly. That's right. In the face of death, all secrets are unimportant. Shaoan suddenly looked at him strangely and said, Can I ask you a favor? Fan Xian's heart trembled. Although this old man was no longer as brave as he had been in the past, his status was still there. On his way north, he had never asked for anything. What do you want to say? Shaoan's voice was a little strange. I am not afraid of death. But after I die, you will be trapped in this cave alone. I reckon that in the end, you will be so hungry that you will be interested in my corpse. Fan Xian was startled, but he understood what the old man was afraid of. He felt a little disgusted. Your old arms and legs. If I wanted to chew on your flesh, I would be afraid of breaking my own teeth. Shaoan laughed bitterly. When you are really hungry, what can't you do? Fan Xian frowned. You're not even afraid of death, and you're afraid of me eating your flesh? Shaoan stared at him. There are many people in this world who are not afraid of death, but they are afraid of cockroaches. He paused. I am not afraid of death, but I am afraid of being eaten by you after I die. That feeling is not good. The effects of the medicine had temporarily replenished Shaoan's energy, so his speech had gradually become smoother. The wounds on his body had long since stopped bleeding, but the strange red in his eyes had deepened. This was not a good sign. Fan Xian looked at him and shook his head with a bitter smile. Don't worry. If you die, I will immediately throw you into the valley. His pupils suddenly contracted. He looked at Shaoan and quietly asked, Old man, have you eaten human flesh before? The cave suddenly became quiet. For a long time, Shaoan's voice did not ring out. After a long while, the old man said expressionlessly, When I went to the temple, the mountains were sealed off by heavy snow. There was nothing to eat, so I had to eat human flesh. Fan Xian's heart thumped. Although he had dug up graves and dissected corpses since he was young, the thought of eating human flesh still made him feel disgusted. He unconsciously looked away from Shaoan's withered lips. Shaoan laughed strangely. Human flesh, in fact, is really disgusting. But what Xueqi ate was much more delicious than what I had. Fan Xian's heart trembled again. Today, the high and mighty Grandmaster revered by tens of thousands of people, the imperial advisor of Northern Qi, Xueqi, had actually eaten human flesh? He immediately figured out the crux of the matter. Since Shaoan knew where the temple was, and Xueqi was a disciple of the temple, then the two of them must have gone to the temple at the same time. For two great masters to have fallen to the point of eating the flesh of one another, one could only imagine the dangers of the journey. But he did not understand why Xueqi had to kill Shaoan. Was it just to hide the fact that he had eaten human flesh? When did you and Xueqi go to the temple? Xiaowen unexpectedly closed his mouth. Fan Xian was like a diner, looking at a plate of duck skin noodles served by a waiter, and then watching the waiter take it away. Fan Xian's breath was stuck in his chest, unable to come out for a long time. He could not help but say angrily, "Seeing that we are about to die, can't you let me die a little more happily?" Xiaowen rolled his eyes at him and laughed mockingly. "Are you stupid?" Fan Xian sighed. "For you, this secret is no longer of any use to protect your life. Why bother hiding it? The temple is to the north." Very suddenly, very without warning, Xiaowen spoke. "How far north?" "In the snowy lands of the extreme north, if you follow the northern prison pass, it will take you more than 3 months. At this time, the sky outside the cave was gradually darkening. Fan Xian's expression did not change, but his heart was a little nervous. He knew that he had finally succeeded halfway. At least he knew the general location of the temple. His heart slightly tightened. The mountain wind gradually picked up, and the summer chill on Mount Yen grew. He looked at Xiaowen, who had closed his eyes and was waiting for death. Like a friend, he began to chat casually. "Dying old man, what do you think about the scenery of the temple?" Xiaowen did not open his eyes. He lightly panted. "It's just a big temple. What scenery could there be? What about you? Which rock did you jump out of, kid?" Fan Xian yawned wearily and said, "I am from Danzhou, and Danzhou does not have much to look at. There are only 2 trees planted in the back garden of my house. One is a date tree, and the other is also a date tree." Chapter 240. There are no trees in the temple. The temple is hidden within a snowy mountain. Legend has it that it only shows its true face for 2 days a year, and if one is not sincere, it is impossible to see it. Xiaowen's old voice was calm as he spoke. The temple had a very important meaning to him. Because he knew the relationship between the temple and that little girl, Chen Pingping had paid a great price to capture him back to the Qing kingdom. It was also because he knew the location of the temple that Xueqi, who had benefited the most from the temple, wanted to silence him. The northern Qi emperor had extravagantly hoped to receive help from heaven from the temple. But what was the temple? It was nothing more than a temple. Xiaowen suddenly felt that the first half of his life was fake. Only the second half of his life behind bars was real. The old man looked at the darkening sky outside the cave. "Master Fan, do you believe in the existence of God?" he asked with a wooden expression. Fan Xian was silent. He thought of his rebirth and the box. He nodded. "I believe in the existence of God more than anyone else in the world." "What is God?" "If I knew what God was, then I would be God." Xiaowen looked at him with admiration. For someone as young as you to be able to see so clearly is rare. He paused. But His Majesty was still young at the time, so he did not see clearly. Fan Xian knew that the story was about to begin. He couldn't help but feel nervous and expectant. "Do you know what the world was like 30 years ago? The kingdom of Wei was powerful, and could unify the world at any time." "Correct. At that time, I was already the leader of the Wei Kingdom's Red Cavalry, and His Majesty's confidant." Xiaowen recalled the past, but his expression was strange. He didn't seem to be immersed in the glory of that day, nor did he bear any grudges. Perhaps because he was about to die. He was indifferent and calm. The world of that day was the world of the Kingdom of Wei. All of its talents were in the court. But the ones who truly stirred up the court, aside from the previous emperor, were 2 pairs of brothers. Fan Xian saw that the old man's expression seemed to be able to hold on, and he felt somewhat reassured. One of them was Yuan Zhuang Mohan. "Correct. That brother of mine was more promising than I was." Xiaowen's expression softened. "And he's more sentimental than I am. I was imprisoned by the Kingdom of Qing for 20 years, but he still remembers me. I owe him. Why doesn't anyone know that you 2 are brothers?" "The reason is simple. My reputation is too vicious, and who knows how many innocent people I've killed in secret. As a scholar, he naturally doesn't like me, and I don't want to have anything to do with him," Xiaowen replied calmly. Fan Xian paused and changed the subject. "Who are the other pair of brothers?" "It's Zhan Qingfeng and Xueqi." Zhan Qingfeng. The father of the founding emperor of northern Qi, A famous general of his generation? Fan Xian was shocked. It turned out that Xueqi was so close to the royal family of northern Qi. No wonder back then. He did his best to protect the current Empress Dowager and Emperor, and the royal family respected Xueqi so much. Xueqi is Zhan Qingfeng's younger brother. Ever since he was young, he was determined to become an ascetic monk, cultivating the way of the heavens. He strived to one day prove his way and enter the temple. Xiaowen said sarcastically, "Most people believe in the temple, but who has actually seen it in the past 1,000 years? It's just that those ascetic monks preach the way everywhere, and their lives are even more pitiful than those of beggars." "But the temple really does exist," Fan Xian reminded him. "Correct." Xiaowen closed his eyes. At the time, the previous emperor had passed away, and the young emperor ascended to the throne. Although this emperor treated us courtiers fairly well, for some reason, he was strangely afraid of death. All day long, he wanted to practice the art of immortality. Fan Xian said, "At that time, Northern Wei was the strongest, and as the emperor, he had nothing to worry about. It was only natural that he would think of these things." Xiaowen continued, "So at that time, Xueqi took the opportunity to enter the palace and persuade His Majesty to send a diplomatic mission out to sea in search of the temple. He said that if the immortals of the temple taught His Majesty immortal magic, then he would naturally be able to live forever. When His Majesty heard this, there was no reason for him to refuse. He smiled bitterly. As His Majesty's trusted aide and leader of the Crimson Cavalry, this matter naturally fell on my head. Xueqi was the one who proposed it, and he was extremely fanatical about the temple. Naturally, he would not stay out of it." Xiaowen said lightly, "After gathering the strength of the entire Wei kingdom, and searching for who knows how long, we finally found a clue. So Xueqi and I led 1,000 men north." Although the dying old man spoke calmly, Fan Xian knew that the process must have been quite complicated. The temple was worshipped by the people of the world, but it was illusory and without a trace. To be able to find a definite clue was in itself a very astonishing matter. The old and indifferent voice echoed endlessly in the cave. Outside the cave, the light of the sky and the mountains gradually dimmed. Fan Xian listened in silence, and at the right moment, he asked questions. His brain worked furiously. Through Xiaowen's memories, he drew a rough map of the route that the procession had taken to the temple. Time seemed to have returned to more than 30 years ago. The calm air of the yellow mountain outside the cave had turned into a blizzard. In the old man's memories, Fan Xian seemed to see an expedition consisting of 1,000 men. Through a sky full of wind and snow, they struggled to make their way through the incomparably wild north. They wore leather boots and thick leather clothing. Only their eyes were exposed, but they still could not stop the bone-chilling wind from pouring into their bodies. At the front of the procession were the two leaders of the group, Xiaowen, who was in the prime of his life, and the young pious ascetic monk Xueqi. The further north the procession went, the more difficult it became. The further they went, the fewer people there were. Some people froze to death, some fell into icy valleys and disappeared, and some were crushed to death by birds of prey in the sky. In short, as the expedition progressed, the procession became shorter and shorter, and the atmosphere became more and more strange. The world was a sheet of white. Because they had stayed in this dry and cruel environment for too long, some of the people in the procession gradually became blind. They were heartlessly abandoned by Xiaowen in the wilderness. In the distance, some dire wolves that could withstand the cold waited for the blind people to die. Everything happened quietly, even if it was something as tragic as death. The procession walked for a long time, and finally came to a large mountain in the extreme north. There was only a narrow path between the mountains, and the snow was so thick that it had long since obscured the color of the mountain. It looked like an endless chain of ice mountains. When the remaining 100 or so people entered the mountain, they found that behind the snowy mountain was still a world covered in ice and snow. Even the animals were few and far between. The procession set up camp with great tenacity, hoping to find traces of the temple here. But many days passed, and they found nothing. Winter came. Heavy snow sealed the mountain. The sun went down. The strongest survived to the end. In the endless night, Xiaowen and Xueqi sat back to back in a tent. Around them were piles of corpses. The fire had not been extinguished. The remnants of the tent and the clothes of the dead gave the two of them a last glimmer of warmth, a glimmer of hope. That was the wrath of the heavens. In the cave, Xueqi opened his eyes with some difficulty. The scarlet color in his pupils became more and more intense, but there was endless fear in his eyes. The temple knows that mortals are trying to find them, so the heavens are angry and have sent endless darkness. Fan Xian looked at the old man. After a while he said quietly, "That was called the polar night." He confirmed the location of the temple in his heart. Of course, Xueqi did not know what the polar night was, but that memory was clearly deeply engraved in his mind. He said with a perplexed expression, "At the time, Xueqi was eating human flesh in an extremely sweet and stingy manner. He was praying piously to the heavens. I couldn't help but despise him. Unexpectedly. Perhaps in the end, he really did move the immortals in the temple, and so the sky suddenly brightened." Fan Xian couldn't help but look at Xueqi. He wondered how the two of them had been able to survive in the polar night that lasted for months. Even if they had human flesh to eat and tents to burn, that kind of loneliness and struggle between the two of them would have probably driven them mad. Xueqi suddenly laughed and said, "The sky brightened in an instant. At that time, Xueqi and I were at the end of our lives. But suddenly we found hope. We didn't know where the power came from, but it supported us to continue living." "And then you found the temple." Fan Xian picked up the dagger and put it by his side. He asked quietly, "What was the temple like?" "Many years ago, outside the snowy mountains, two people so thin they were only bones. With great difficulty, they walked out of their tents. Their sunken eyes and sallow complexions, and their swollen gums as they breathed, all revealed one thing: they were about to die. The light of the day was finally not so stingy. After coming out for a while, some animals awoke from their caves. Although the two of them were already arrows at the end of their flight, they were still much more ferocious than the wild beasts. So they were able to replenish themselves and stand up again. That day, they narrowed their eyes and looked at the snowy mountains in front of them in a daze. They had no idea where the temple they had been so painstakingly searching for was. Here, there was only a vast expanse of white. It was very clean. Suddenly, a ray of light shone down from the dark blue sky. The light from the snowy mountains twisted strangely. Very suddenly, a beautiful temple appeared out of thin air in the mountains. This grand temple was built against the mountain. The black stone walls and the light gray eaves supported each other. It was indescribably dignified. Xueqi stared at the mountains in a daze. Suddenly, he fell to the ground in agitation. He looked in the direction of the temple and burst into tears. Xueqi stood there dumbfounded. A moment later, he woke up and sat down in the snow. He didn't have the strength to stand up for a long time. This was the temple. Chapter 241. Xueqi, still a young man, and Xueqi, with a face full of shock, began to climb up the snowy mountain. Their faces were no longer frozen by the wind and snow that filled the sky. Instead, they were filled with a complex mix of emotions: excitement, joy, nervousness, excitement, and a faint sense of fear. There was no fear on Xueqi's face, only incomparable fanaticism. He was an ascetic monk, and his whole life he had longed to be able to touch the door of the temple with his own hands, to be able to gently kowtow to the stone steps in front of the temple. The vast universe on the snowy mountain seemed very close, but when the two of them tried to approach it, they discovered that the temple was an extremely distant existence. After climbing for a long time, they felt that the temple was getting further and further away. Those black, solemn stone walls were like an illusory shadow that could vanish into the snowy mountain at any moment. According to legend, the temple only appeared twice a year. Xueqi and Xueqi did not want to give up on this opportunity, so they used all their strength to climb up the snowy mountain. They didn't know how long they had climbed, but their bodies were covered in cuts from the icicles. They were dripping with blood, and they left two faint lines of blood on the snowy ground. With a clap, Xueqi's palm finally touched the stone steps in front of the temple. The young ascetic monk could not help but impudently clap twice, expressing the ecstasy and indescribable excitement in his heart. Xueqi was slower than him. He secretly gripped the hidden weapon in his sleeve, and looked at the main door of the temple with a trace of fear. This door was at least 7 meters tall, like a book that a god had thrown into the mortal world. The door in the Wei Kingdom's palace looked like a miniature version of the door of the temple. It was far less grand and majestic than this temple. It was indeed not a place for mortals to live. The stone walls of the temple were covered in dust. It must have been many years since anyone had come to visit this most mysterious place in the world. Xueqi swallowed and prepared to find a way to enter the temple. He had been entrusted with an important task by the emperor, and had requested the recipe for immortality. Now that success was at hand, he was naturally excited. But Xueqi was not like him. He very devoutly knelt in front of the temple, constantly kowtowing. Gradually, blood began to seep from his forehead. He walked towards the door of the temple and stretched out his hand, but he could not touch the giant door. It seemed that as his fingertips moved forward, the giant door was retreating in a strange way. The divine temple was right in front of them, but it was far away. 30 years later in the cave, the dying Shan's eyes were filled with a trace of sadness. I couldn't get in. Fan Xian loosened his tightly clenched hands and quietly said, "This is something that can be imagined. Otherwise, the 4 great grandmasters would become the 5 great grandmasters. Xueqi is stronger than me. Even if I had his luck, I would not be able to enter the realm of a great grandmaster." Xueqi shook his head. But Xueqi was not able to enter either. That temple seemed to be protected by some mysterious power. Back then, Xueqi and I were the strongest warriors in the world, and yet we were unable to enter. Fan Xian came to a realization. Among the secrets of the world, teacher Fei Jie had once mentioned that Xueqi had knelt on the stone steps in front of the temple for a long time before he gained the power to dominate a region. It seemed that this rumor was somewhat true. He suddenly furrowed his brows and asked, "What exactly is a temple?" This was a question that Xueqi could not answer. The old man said weakly, "There is a large plaque at the front door of the divine temple. But it is very old, and I cannot make out what is written on it. I suspect that it is a rune left behind by the heavens." Fan Xian's heart trembled. "What kind of rune is it?" Xueqi looked at the excited Fan Xian, and his eyebrows twitched. It seemed that this young man on the brink of death was still so curious about the unknown. He was a little interested. "It is the character Wu." The old man stretched out his finger with some difficulty and gestured in the air. Fan Xian immediately understood, and said to himself, "The hidden dragon does not use?" As soon as the words left his mouth, he laughed in spite of himself. "There are 3 identical runes," Xueqi continued. His finger moved up and down in the air, and then up and down again, drawing 2 arcs. His fingertips pierced through the air, giving off a mysterious feeling. Fan Xian was a little surprised. He knew that he could not discover anything from such simple runes. Did the divine temple have anything to do with his rebirth? Did it have anything to do with his mother? It seemed that he would have to wait for the future to find out. But he might not be as lucky as Xueqi and Xueqi, who would be able to survive the long polar night. "I don't think the story ends so simply." Xueqi coughed. "That's right. When a goal that you have so painstakingly pursued is right in front of you, but you can never reach it, you will always feel a strong sense of dissatisfaction." Xueqi very sincerely knelt on the stone steps in front of the divine temple, and I began to slowly walk towards the high wall on the side of the mountain. Outside the cave, the darkness enveloped the 2 of them. There was no fire, so there was no light. Xueqi's indifferent voice recounted the events of decades ago, and it seemed very strange. Fan Xian suddenly said in a soft voice, "You were looking for a sewer?" Xueqi looked at the young man's silhouette at the mouth of the cave. "You were in the same profession. Of course you knew what I would have done. You couldn't even get close to the wall. How could you have entered the divine temple through a sewer? Besides..." Fan Xian frowned. For a place like this left behind by the heavens, it is not certain that there would be a sewer. "So I failed," Xueqi said straightforwardly. "Now that I think about it, I was very brave at the time. Facing the divine temple, I still thought of these earthly methods. And then? Xueqi sank into a very strange mood. Then I walked back to the main entrance of the divine temple, and found that Xueqi was putting something in his pocket. I was a little curious, and just as I was about to ask him about it, the old man's speech slowed, and Fan Xian's heart jumped. The door of the divine temple opened. "Huh!" Fan Xian subconsciously moved a little closer to Xueqi, as if he wanted to protect this guy from 30 years ago. An absurd smile appeared in Xueqi's eyes. In a hoarse voice he said, The door of the divine temple opened without a sound. I was overjoyed, and just as I was about to enter, from the world's largest door, a most wonderful person suddenly ran out. The most wonderful person? Yes, it was a little fairy. Xueqi stood stupidly outside the door of the divine temple, watching helplessly as a little girl rushed into his arms. He almost spat out a mouthful of blood. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Xueqi rush to the door of the divine temple like a ferocious tiger, tangling with a black light inside the divine temple. The young Xueqi was already the youngest superior 9th-level master in the world. At this moment, he was stimulated by some unknown reason, and the power within his body was completely unleashed to the peak. He was actually entangled with the mysterious black shadow inside the divine temple. Qi flew in all directions, and the snow was thrown into chaos. After a few breaths, Xueqi remembered that there was a little girl in his arms. Before he could react, he heard the little girl shout to Xueqi, who was on the bluestone steps, "Retreat!" It was a very simple word, but coming from the mouth of the little girl, it was as if she was the ruler of a generation. No one could question her. That kind of natural power made Xueqi's heart tremble, and then he received a slap in the face. "You retreat too." Xueqi floated away, and Xueqi, holding the little girl in his arms, tumbled down the stone steps. He was 30 meters away from the main door of the divine temple. The black light suddenly shrank back into the divine temple, and did not pursue. Xueqi looked at the giant door with lingering fear. He thought that the black light seemed to be a human figure, and he could not help but be afraid, because Xueqi was now beside him, spitting up blood. Even Xueqi was not a match for the other. The people inside the divine temple could not be viewed with the eyes of mortals. He came to a realization very quickly. It must have been that when he went to find the sewers, Xueqi, who was kneeling on the bluestone steps, and the little girl in his arms had come to some kind of agreement to help her escape from the divine temple. But who was this little girl? "Hold me, pull him, go." The little girl seemed to be a little afraid of the cold, and buried her face in Xueqi's chest. Xueqi did not dare to be negligent. He grabbed Xueqi by the collar and ran down the snowy mountain. He did not know how long they ran, but he finally ran back to his tent. It was not until he sat down in his tent, panting, that he came to his senses. Why did he run? The elixir of immortality that His Majesty wanted had not yet arrived. Why did he listen to this little girl? And strangely enough, the immortals in the divine temple did not chase him. Xueqi turned around and saw the little girl crouching, pinching her nose, looking at the leftover human bones in the corner of the tent. What a pitiful and hateful human. The little girl turned around and looked at Xueqi. It was only now that Xueqi could see her face clearly. Clear as water, pure as snow, eyes like stars. She was a beauty that no mortal should have. In the darkness of the cave, Fan Xian's expression could not be seen, but his voice was a little strange. How old was that little girl? 4 years old. At most 4 years old. Xueqi's eyes were open, and it was as if he could still see that beautiful face. When I held her in my arms, I felt that she was so light it was like she did not exist. Fan Xian was a little confused. Also 4 years old? Why do you say also? It's nothing. Fan Xian smiled, and his eyes lit up. Do you know who that little girl is? Xueqi spoke with absolute certainty. Of course I do. She is a little girl who longs for the world of mortals, so she ran out of the divine temple. Fan Xian laughed and shook his finger. Believe me, she is just a little girl who ran into the divine temple to steal things. Chapter 242. Hearing Fan Xian's confident words, Xueqi began to cough violently for a long time. It was the middle of the night, and he didn't know if the brocade guard searching below could hear him. Fan Xian was a little worried. He took out a thin needle and probed it into Xueqi's neck to help soothe the pulse of his heart. Fan Xian's fingers gently rested on Xueqi's neck, and he felt a slight wetness and stickiness. He sniffed and smelled blood. He knew that Xueqi had begun to cough up blood. His face was expressionless, but his heart was stirred. That was a fairy. The dying old man stubbornly confirmed the judgment he had made 30 years ago. Fan Xian didn't want to argue with him on this matter. How could a 4-year-old girl carry a trunk? Who was carrying that trunk? What trunk? Xueqi's voice was straight, and it didn't seem like he was lying. Fan Xian was a little surprised. He knew that there was no need for him to hide anything, and Wu Zhu had not yet appeared. Wu Zhu had once said that he and his mother had left home together. Where was that home? According to the letter his mother had left behind, Wu Zhu had once fought with the strong men of the temple, and had lost part of his memory. Why would Wu Zhu fight with the men of the temple? Was it jealousy? What happened after that? This was the duty of all who listened to the story. Xueqi, the old storyteller, was about to die. Fan Xian naturally wouldn't forget to ask this question. Inside the tent, Xueqi lay on top of the fur. His breathing was a little ragged. He didn't know what the 4-year-old girl had promised him, but it had caused him to go against his beliefs and dare to attack the men of the temple. Xueqi looked at the little girl, who had lifted the flap of the tent and was looking out into the snow. The wind and snow had not lessened, and the little girl's skin was whiter than snow. Her small hands gripped the thick tent cloth tightly. She was so small, and looking out into the vast world, she felt a sense of loneliness that did not match her age. Carefully, he moved to Xueqi's side, and put his hand into the opening of Xueqi's robe. That's what I gave him. The little girl didn't even turn her head. Don't touch it. Sean looked at the little girl, and a fierce glint suddenly appeared in his eyes. What Xueqi was hiding in his bosom must be some sort of heavenly book from the temple. Xueqi could not help but be tempted. But when he remembered that the little girl was a fairy who had sneaked out of the temple, Xueqi immediately gave up on the idea. He knelt down respectfully and kowtowed to the little fairy at the door, saying, I am the commander of the Discipline Commission of Dawei. Under the orders of His Majesty, I have come to the temple to listen to the heavenly edict. I beg the heavenly deity to grant me the elixir of immortality. This was Sean's mission, and he had not forgotten it. The girl at the door laughed when she heard that. She laughed very happily. After a while, she suddenly threw a pill at Sean. You helped me, so I'll help you too. Since that monk has benefited, you should benefit too. Xueqi took the pill and examined it carefully. He couldn't see anything special about it, but since it was a gift from a fairy, he couldn't ignore it. He took out the jade box and carefully placed it inside. You should go back. The little girl's tone was somewhat old-fashioned. There's no point in staying here. Xueqi was a little disappointed. They had finally found the temple, but they hadn't entered. He didn't know what the immortals inside looked like. Thank you, fairy, for the pill. Don't come here again, the little girl suddenly said softly. And don't tell anyone where the temple is. If I find out that you have revealed the location of the temple, I will kill you. The little girl turned around, her young face full of frost. Do you hear me? Xueqi bowed his head in agreement. Although such cold words came out of the mouth of a little girl who looked like she was carved from ice and snow, the fact that a 4-year-old girl could speak so clearly proved that she was not an ordinary person. Even though Xueqi was the leader of the Tiki of Dawei, he still didn't dare disobey. The old man had no choice but to obey. After Xueqi woke up, the fairy forced the two of us to swear a deadly oath. Then we began to head south. During those few days, the smile on the fairy's face gradually grew. It was as if she thought that stepping into the world of mortals was a very interesting thing. Xueqi continued to recollect. It's strange. Every time Xueqi and I looked at her back, we couldn't feel any mysterious power within her. Ah, there is a difference between immortals and mortals. We are mortals, and we can't understand. Then one day, the fairy turned around and looked at the snowy mountain behind her. She suddenly said to herself, He's too pitiful. I remember those words very clearly, because I have never seen such compassion on a mortal's face. Of course, Fan Xian knew that his mother wasn't some fairy. At the time, she probably didn't have much power, but she was able to scare two of the world's most powerful beings. That brain of hers was quite good. But he didn't understand who his mother was referring to when she said, too pitiful. And he didn't believe in compassion. He couldn't help but laugh. Xueqi mocked. You and I are rats that live in the gutters. How could we know the beauty of a crane in the clouds of the 9th heaven? I can't describe the look in the fairy's eyes, but Xueqi and I could never forget it. Fan Xian was silent. The next day, the fairy suddenly disappeared. I don't know where she went. In that cold, endless snow, she suddenly disappeared without a trace. Xueqi and I were scared half to death. In the cave, Xueqi gasped for breath as he recalled. It was the most mysterious adventure of my life. To be able to see a fairy that didn't belong to this world, I was lucky. And then you and Xueqi returned to Northern Wei? Fan Xian asked. That's right. The journey back was more dangerous than when we left. But in short, we came back safely. Xueqi said. I gave the pill that the fairy bestowed upon me to His Majesty, and that was the end of the matter. Fan Xian said. Don't lie to me. That pill must have fallen into your stomach a long time ago. Xueqi laughed hoarsely. I knew I couldn't lie to you. Fan Xian said, where in this world can there be an elixir of immortality? That kind of temptation is something that no normal person could resist. Xueqi sighed. Of course, after I took the pill, I realized that it only improved my constitution. There was no way I could live forever. Only then did I realize that the fairy could also lie. I believe that the fairy loved to lie, Fan Xian said, a little absent-minded. Perhaps even her death was a lie. What death? Xueqi said. How could a fairy die? Fan Xian ignored him. He closed his eyes and committed Xueqi's recollection to memory. Then he stood up and gripped the dagger. There was no light all around. Dark clouds covered the stars and the moon. It was so dark that Xueqi couldn't see his movements. Why did Xueqi want you dead? This was Fan Xian's last question. I don't think that knowing the location of the temple could cause such a huge uproar. Xueqi felt that Fan Xian's question was strange. Everyone knows what the temple means to the world. If such an important piece of news were to spread, I'm afraid the world would be thrown into chaos. Whether it's the child of the Zhan family of the kingdom of Qi or the sinister emperor of the Qing kingdom, they would all send troops to the north to pay their respects. The strongest of the world would constantly try to find the temple. Fan Xian rubbed his nose. The temple? You've been there, and you said it was just a big temple. What was there to pay respects to? Xueqi laughed coldly. Xueqi only knelt in front of the temple, and then he became the greatest grandmaster in the world. For a martial cultivator, this kind of temptation is unimaginably strong. And do you really think that Xueqi is a saint? Seeing him kneel so piously in front of the temple, but the fairy only gave him a book, and in the blink of an eye, he overthrew the temple he had believed in all his life and took the risk to attack. In the face of profit, he is just a great villain who is good at pretending. Xueqi continued, if he kills me, he will be the only one in the world who knows where the temple is. What is in the temple? Perhaps Xueqi will never know, but he has already reaped enough benefits. So why would he take the risk and allow the other strongest of the world to have this opportunity? Fan Xian thought about it. This was indeed the case, and he vaguely understood why Xueqi was so obsessed with killing Xueqi. Perhaps it was to protect his glorious image as the imperial advisor, and not to expose the ugly things he had done on the journey north. Perhaps Xueqi knew what was in the temple, and that it would bring unknown dangers to the world. What is in the temple? Fan Xian sank into deep thought. His finger unconsciously traced the word Xueqi had spoken of, the word do at the door of the temple. His finger gradually sped up, and there was a sound of rushing wind. For 1,000 years, the world has known that the temple does not meddle in worldly affairs. Xueqi and I going to find it was already a very risky gamble. Reality has proven that so long as we leave the temple, the people in the temple will not cause trouble for the people of the world. Xueqi is the protector of northern Qi. How would he dare to take the risk of offending the heavens? Xueqi's energy was gradually waning, and his voice was getting quieter and quieter. But the fear in his voice still lingered. Furthermore, the fairy forced us to swear a deadly oath. Even if Xueqi always boasted that he was the one closest to the heavens, would he dare to break his oath? Don't take things like oaths too seriously, said Fan Xian. Didn't you tell me the location of the temple? That's because I am going to die. Xueqi turned his head to the side with some difficulty. And you will die in this cave. Fan Xian smiled apologetically. I don't think so. Chapter 243. In the silent night of the valley, there were no weeds as far as the eye could see. Instead, there was a dark night sky that stretched between two precipitous walls. Fan Xian tidied up his clothes and tied up his torn left trouser leg as he said in a quiet voice, I'm sorry. That fairy's surname is Yi. Her name is Yi Qingmei. Yi Qingmei? Xueqi was shocked. What did you say? Could it be that the mistress of the Yi family is the fairy I once met? When the Yi family suddenly rose to prominence, Xueqi was still the head of Northern Wei's secret service. So it was no surprise to Fan Xian that he knew the name of the mistress of the Yi family. He smiled. Aside from the fairy you speak of, who else could have the Yi family change the state of the world in a few short years? So that's how it is, that's how it is. Xueqi coughed again. No wonder the kingdom of Qing could rise so fiercely. So there was the shadow of the temple behind it. Wrong, Fan Xian said. Fan Xian said, you are already a person about to die, so let me tell you, Yi Qingmei, the fairy you speak of, is not an immortal from the temple. She is like us. Just a normal person. Xueqi had not yet recovered from his earlier shock. He did not believe what Fan Xian had said. Instead, he was immersed in his last question before he died. Why? Did the fairy want to capture me and bring me to the kingdom of Qing? As the head of Northern Wei's secret service, he naturally knew the relationship between the Yi family and the Overwatch Council of the kingdom of Qing. The kingdom of Qing had to kill you back then, said Fan Xian. He paused. I must admit that back then, you were a very terrifying person. And the reason why Yi Qingmei sent Chen Pingping to capture you instead of killing you must have been because of your friendship back then. After all, it seems that it was because you broke into the temple that she came to this world. Then. Just who? Ahem. Are you? In the darkness, Xueqi's eyes stared at Fan Xian like two sharp arrows. For an old comrade on the verge of death to still have such sharp eyes, Fan Xian couldn't help but feel a little startled. He chuckled. Me. After a moment of silence, he opened his mouth. I am Yi Qingmei's son. Yi Qingmei's son. How Fan Xian wanted to be able to say it aloud to everyone in this familiar yet strange, intimate yet inharmonious world. Unfortunately, there was no such possibility right now. The night was getting darker, and the darkness before dawn had arrived. In a cave with only the two of them, Fan Xian spoke quietly and faintly. I am Yi Qingmei's son. For some reason, the moment these words left his mouth, Fan Xian felt much more relaxed. His heart, which had borne too much pressure, struggled free of the many branches and vines on it in an instant. At least, it obtained a temporary relaxation and gently embraced the taste of freedom in the night wind. The sky gradually brightened. There weren't many memories, but Xueqi spoke very slowly. After a day and a half, Fan Xian had finally achieved the most important goal of his journey north. He looked at Xueqi and said quietly, Do you have anything to tell me? Xuan just looked at him with a strange expression. After a while he gasped and said, You are her son? Fan Xian nodded and smiled. I don't have the habit of calling someone my mother. Xueqi coughed violently, shaking out the last few drops of blood in his heart. He seemed to be crying and laughing at the same time. No wonder you know so many things. No wonder you are so interested in the location of the temple. Before he died, the old man finally saw everything clearly. Gasping for breath, he said, It seems that this cave won't be able to hold you. I don't have the habit of throwing myself into a death trap. Fan Xian had already prepared everything. He moved closer to Xueqi. Xueqi suddenly stared fixedly into his eyes. If you want to live well, don't go to the temple. Fan Xian's face was calm. He didn't reply. Xueqi didn't look at him again either. He only turned his gaze to the precipice behind Fan Xian. He frowned slightly, as if thinking about something. After a while, the old man gasped softly. I used to think that I was a ruthless man who didn't fear death. I only sought freedom. Now that death is right in front of me, I know that everyone is afraid of death. There is no one in this world who isn't afraid of death. For some reason, Fan Xian looked at the dying Xueqi and slowly loosened his right hand. He said softly, But perhaps death is not the end. Perhaps you will go to a completely unfamiliar world. This was his greatest secret, his greatest regret. Xueqi's gaze fell into the distance. His bloodshot eyes gradually softened. Are you really the son of the little fairy? No, Yi Qingmei? Without waiting for Fan Xian to reply, Xueqi continued indifferently. But you don't look like her at all. Fan Xian said, You've only seen her when she was 4. How can you be so sure? Xueqi smiled. Because you are far less beautiful than the little fairy. Fan Xian subconsciously tilted his head. In this world, There are not many women more beautiful than me. The look in your eyes is different. How is it different? Xueqi looked at him. With a hint of coldness he said, "Only now do I understand." On that snowy wasteland, the little fairy gazed at the vast white earth. Her eyes were still soft and compassionate. I never knew how to describe it, but now I seem to feel the coming of that darkness. Only then do I understand that all the emotions in her eyes were expressing one thing. What is it? Fan Xian's heart jumped. The love and attachment to life. Xueqi smiled and said, "Although there is always a bright smile in your eyes, it is not the same. Your mother should be an extremely sentimental person, but you are an extremely heartless person." Fan Xian smiled. "I don't deny that. I've killed many people in my life, so I never expected to have a good death." Xueqi did not continue this topic. He looked at the misty sky in a trance. To be able to die in this cave, as you say, a good grave is not bad. Fan Xian half squatted by his side and put his left hand on the old man's shoulder. He found that the old man's muscles had gradually softened. The sky outside the precipice was still dim, but through the mist that pervaded the valley, a holy light could be seen. This light shone softly on Xueqi's withered face. It made the secret agent, whose hands were stained with blood, and who had spent the latter half of his life alone and miserable, feel a sense of relief. "Danzhou doesn't have those 2 date trees, does it?" This was the last thing Xueqi would ask in this world. Fan Xian took the last needle from under the old man's ear. After a moment, he confirmed that he was dead. He tilted his head slightly and looked at Xueqi's body. Suddenly, in a soft voice he said, "Although Danzhou doesn't have those 2 date trees, perhaps there is a better world waiting for you after you die." Xueqi's eyes had already softly closed. His pupils were bloodshot, and he could no longer look at this strange world. Fan Xian let out a murky breath and laid Xueqi's body flat in the deepest part of the shallow cave. As for whether or not there would be any eagles pecking at him, it seemed that he had not considered that, so he appeared somewhat cold and emotionless. He walked out of the cave and reached out his hand into the air outside the precipice. The white mountain mist moved along with his fingers, and all he caught was empty air. The brocade god should still be searching for the bodies or traces of the old man and the young man at the bottom of the valley. The precipice of Swallow Mountain was as smooth as a mirror. No one would have thought that someone would be able to jump off the cliff and stand steadily. And no one would have thought that someone would be able to climb up the slippery and wet mountain walls. Fan Xian's whole body was like a piece of paper, tightly pressed against the mountain wall. Behind him was the thick morning mist, effectively concealing his figure. Even if someone was on the opposite side of the mountain wall, they would not be able to discover that he was slowly climbing up like a gecko. When he was in Danzhou, from the age of 12 to 16, he had spent a full 4 years controlling his Xueqi outside his body. This was an extremely foolish method of cultivation, but Wu Zhu did not care. Fan Xian practiced it to his heart's content. Unexpectedly, later on in Fan Xian's life, it had helped him so much. Crawling like a gecko, sticking close like a snake, Fan Xian carefully climbed up and up and up, his face expressionless. The effects of the ephedra pill had long since faded, and his Xueqi was somewhat lacking, so he did not dare to be careless. The shallow grass rustled slightly, and a hand clung to a rock beside the precipice. A person covered from head to toe in black night clothing climbed out of the valley like a ghost. Fan Xian's face was covered by a hat. He turned his head and saw that the valley was quiet, as if nothing had happened. After a moment, his heart skipped a beat. Through the thick morning mist, he gazed at the mountain forest, but he could see nothing. But he felt as if someone was watching him, and that person's gaze seemed to be fixed on him. Fan Xian lowered his head slightly and turned around. He did not think, nor did he have time to think. Like a black arrow, he plunged into the thick mist, running in the direction of the capital. Outside the residence of the diplomatic mission in the capital, Gouda held a long knife in his hand. His eyes were as round as a fierce tiger's as he stared at the people in front of the courtyard. The young master had not left the house for a day and night, and all visits from Northern Qi officials had been refused. But early that morning, someone from the brocade guard had come to deliver an edict from the palace, saying that the young emperor wanted Fan Xian to enter the palace for a chat. Few people knew that Fan Xian was not with the diplomatic mission. The commander of the brocade guard, Shen Zhong, hoped that Fan Xian was not with the diplomatic mission, but after a night of searching, Fan Xian's body had not been found. So Northern Qi finally became suspicious, and so they urgently wanted to know where Fan Xian was. Who would have thought that the people of Qing would be so rude and unreasonable? Using Fan Xian's drunkenness as an excuse, they forcibly prevented the Northern Qi officials from entering the diplomatic mission. Conflict was about to break out, but at that moment, a rustling sound came from the end of the street. It was not the sound of street sweeps, but footsteps. The Northern Qi officials were overjoyed. Chapter 244. The morning in Shangjing was bustling. Several groups of people had arrived at the entrance of the diplomatic mission. The Northern Qi officials and the brocade guard parted to make a path. They bowed respectfully to the girl who had leisurely approached. "Greetings, Miss Haitang." Haitang's eyes were drowsy, as if she hadn't woken up yet. Her hands were still in the pockets of her flowery dress. She yawned and asked, "What are you all doing here?" One of the officials hurried forward to report, "I have come by imperial edict to invite Sir Fan Xian into the palace," but Sir Fan's bodyguard refused to announce his arrival. More officials from the Brocade Guard and Honglu Temple came forward to report their intentions. In short, they all wanted to see Fan Xian. Haitang was slightly startled. She didn't seem to know that so many things had happened in Shangjing in the past 2 days. There was a trace of confusion in her eyes. "Why didn't you announce it?" Tiger Guard Gao De knew that although this girl looked like a country bumpkin, she was actually an important figure in Northern Qi. More importantly, during the days the diplomatic mission had been in Shangjing, his young master had often wandered the streets with this strange woman, so he didn't dare to slight her. He stepped forward and said in a low voice, "Sir Fan drank too much last night, so he is not feeling well. He is resting, and it would not be good to disturb him." Haitang muttered to herself for a moment, then said quietly, "Let me take a look." Having said this, she walked toward the front door of the diplomatic mission. These days, she had often come to the diplomatic mission to find Fan Xian, so the people of the diplomatic mission had long since become accustomed to her presence. Seeing her stride inside, Lin Wan, who was standing on the stone steps, couldn't help but feel a trace of panic flash through his eyes, but he didn't dare to stop her. Gao De, however, was wholeheartedly protective of his master. He frowned and gripped the cloth hilt of his long knife. He stood in front of Haitang and said in a low voice, "Miss, His last word turned into a muffled grunt. Haitang didn't make a move. She just turned her body slightly. Her cloth shoes, which never seemed to leave the ground, made a rustling sound. For some reason, she was already behind Gao Da's zhenqi, which had been accumulating for a long time, couldn't find an outlet. His shoulders trembled slightly, and his eyes shone brightly. Haitang smiled and turned to gently pat his shoulder. A strange expression flashed across her ordinary face. "Fan Xian and I are friends. I think he will be willing to see me now." When her palm was about to land on Gao Da's shoulder, an extremely gentle and warm current flowed into him. Gao Da slowly closed his eyes. His right hand exerted strength between his thumb and forefinger. The long saber by his side made a sharp sound as it fiercely stabbed into the stone floor beside his feet. The gravel was slightly scattered, and the tip of the saber was more than 3 inches into the ground. In this exchange, although Gao De was extremely skilled, he was still no match for Haitang's realm. Moreover, Haitang's identity was rather special, so he was actually unable to make a move and suffered a loss. Gao De knew that he could not stop Haitang, but he was unwilling to let the young master in the room face Haitang alone. Thus, with a dark expression, he turned and followed the swaying figure into the courtyard. Behind them, the Northern Qi officials and brocade guards did not follow. As long as Haitang could confirm whether or not Fan Xian was in the room, it would be fine. There was no need for them to take the risk. "Good morning, Miss Haitang." Wang Qinian, holding a bowl of salt water and a miniature mace in his hand, appeared in the long corridor of the courtyard that Haitang had to pass through. This trusted aide of Fan Xian had seen Haitang a few times and could be considered to be familiar with her. Haitang smiled slightly. She knew that he was here to stall for time, but she was not in a hurry. "What is that in Sir Wang's hand?" Wang Qinian took out the miniature mace from his mouth and extended it in front of Haitang. He laughed and said, "My master invented the toothbrush." "Toothbrush?" Haitang was slightly surprised. "Brushing your teeth?" "Yes. Why not use willow branches?" Because this thing is easy to use. It's soft and the brush is exquisite, Wang Qinian said in an ingratiating manner. Only now did he realize that placing the toothbrush that had come into contact with his foul mouth in front of Haitang was a very disrespectful thing to do. He quickly took it back and repeatedly apologized. Haitang smiled bitterly, shook her head, and walked inside. Wang Qinian tossed the bowl and the utensils to his subordinate and eagerly followed. He was almost 40 years old, and he ran faster than a rabbit. As he walked, he chatted with Haitang. He also said that Fan Xian had drunk too much yesterday and was probably still resting. How about she come back later? Actually, everyone knew that Haitang's sudden appearance in the diplomatic mission this early in the morning could not have been a coincidence. She had to see Fan Xian. In the distance of the corridor, a figure dressed in white was looking at the two of them. Haitang was moved. She turned her head, and a chill filled her eyes. So it is the great scholar Yun. Yan Bingyun could see that this last disciple of Ku, he was not in a good mood. Although he had been released by the brocade guard, he had always carefully hidden himself in the back of the residence, not wanting to provoke the officials and people of northern Qi. Before he had been imprisoned, Haitang had returned to the palace, and he had met her as the great scholar Yun. Meeting Haitang today made him feel a little awkward, and he silently retreated. Looking at the tightly shut wooden door in front of her, Haitang frowned and reached out to push it open. She was a young woman, and although everyone knew that she had some friendship with Fan Xian, pushing open the door like this was not very polite. Wang Qinian jumped in fright and tried to block the door. But while his qinggong was excellent, there was a huge gap between him and this woman. A gust of wind blew past, and the wooden door creaked open. A drop of cold sweat dripped from Wang Qinian's forehead. He didn't know if he would make it in time. Haitang looked calmly at the large bed in the room. Suddenly she said, "Sir Wang, you may leave." Wang Qinian did not move. A tired, cold voice came from the room. "Wang Qinian, you may leave." Wang Qinian took a deep breath, and a look of joy appeared in his eyes. He immediately calmed down and bowed. "Yes, Sir Fan." Haitang walked in with light steps, and the wooden door closed behind her. She did not seem surprised, nor was she in a hurry. She took a teapot from the table, poured some cold tea into a cup, and sipped it lightly. Then she sat down on a round stool next to the bed. On the bed, under the brocade quilt, Fan Xian's face was pale, and his eyes were smiling. He looked at the village girl sitting by his bed with great interest. After a moment he said, "Are you going to keep looking like this?" Haitang covered her mouth with her hand and yawned. "If it weren't for the Empress Dowager asking me to take a look, do you think I would be happy to come early in the morning and see your ugly state?" Fan Xian smiled and said, "As for my appearance, although I don't like it very much, I know it has nothing to do with the word ugly." He lowered his head to glance at it and then said, "I believe that she is not ugly." Under the quilt, Fan Xian's robe was pulled open, and in his naked chest was a beautiful woman with long hair like a black waterfall, drinking with women for a day and a night. Haitang didn't seem to see the woman in his arms and yawned again. "She's not very beautiful. Are you going to keep looking like this?" "It seems to me that Sir Fan has no intention of stopping me from looking," Haitang said with a smile. In the end, it was Fan Xian who became embarrassed. "Excuse me for a moment, so that the woman in my arms can put on her clothes." He calmly said, "You don't have to give me face, but you have to give the woman face. Women, why make things difficult for women?" After the courtesan finished packing, she looked back at Fan Xian with reluctance. The slight resentment, shyness, and charm in her eyes made Fan Xian praise her acting skills. The courtesan bowed to Haitang with a trace of reverence, then pulled up the hem of her dress and walked out of the room, leaving Haitang and Fan Xian alone. Fan Xian was still lying on the bed, his hands behind his head. He didn't care that Haitang had seen his naked upper body. Haitang was a clever person. She didn't pretend to be shy, nor did she scold him. She acted as if the young man on the bed was a block of wood. She directly said, "Do you know what happened in Shangjing these past 2 days?" Fan Xian was startled, but after a moment he laughed. "Forget it. I can't be bothered to waste words with you. Since I'm in Shangjing, how can I not know? Shang Shanhu lost a group of subordinates this time, and Shaowen was killed by you. I'm sure your teacher will be very happy. Congratulations, Mississippi. Haiteng looked at him calmly, and the pressure in her eyes grew stronger and stronger. But Fan Xian didn't seem to feel it at all. He still smiled. Yes, I knew this would happen, so in order to avoid suspicion, I had to lock myself up in the diplomatic mission for 2 days. I'm sure you understand. Haiteng didn't know whether he was telling the truth or not, but earlier in the courtyard, she had given Fan Xian enough time by taking advantage of Wang Qinyan's delay. No one knew why Haiteng was willing to do this. Since Fan Xian was in the diplomatic mission, Haiteng knew she wouldn't be able to get any more information out of him. This young southern official in front of her, who looked like a beautiful young official, was actually a watertight person. Naturally, she wouldn't be able to catch any clues. She stood up and put her hands in her large pockets. Suddenly, she looked at Fan Xian's naked upper body with interest. Fan Xian stealthily circulated his tyrannical zhenqi, and his beautiful face blushed. Why are you blushing? Haiteng asked with a smile. You're glowing. Fan Xian suddenly felt an indescribable danger approaching. A day and 2 nights of mental exhaustion caused his face to immediately turn deathly white. Why are you white again? Fan Xian took a deep breath and smiled. The night of spring is bitter. Chapter 245. Isn't the spring night too short? Too long is also a pain. The toothbrush you made. I want one. Fan Xian was stunned. He hadn't expected her to make such a request. He smiled bitterly. As far as I know, you can buy them on Xueqi Street. Haiteng smiled. Not as good as you. Thank you for the compliment. I didn't think a noble child like you would be willing to spend so much time on such things. Haiteng looked at Fan Xian as if to re-evaluate him. Fan Xian slowly closed his eyes and said, It is clear that you do not know enough about me. Haiteng was silent for a moment. But I only know that after the Empress Dowager's birthday, you will return home. What about your promise to me? Fan Xian didn't even bother to lift his eyes. When I'm done sleeping, I'll come and talk to you. Haiteng frowned. That would be good. Fan Xian suddenly opened his eyes. I'm not in a good mood today, so I don't want to talk. Goodbye. It was the first time Haiteng had seen Fan Xian so cold, but she didn't react. She simply left the room. Fan Xian lay on the large bed. He was clearly very tired, but he still could not fall asleep. His expression appeared calm, but his mind was a mess. Without enough time, he could not digest what he had heard and felt last night. He opened his bright eyes and looked at the embroidered canopy on top of the bed. His gaze seemed to pierce through the ceiling, straight through the clouds, and cast into the farthest sky. Now that they had confirmed that Fan Xian was in the diplomatic mission, Northern Qi naturally wondered who had tried to rescue Xiao En from the precipice of Mount Yen. This question was naturally raised. Lang Tiao, Friar He, and Shen Zhong sat on 3 chairs, their brows furrowed. Of the 3, Shen Zhong had the highest rank, but Lang Tiao was Ku He's first disciple and the young emperor's martial arts teacher, so he had the highest rank. Friar He, on the other hand, was silent. Yesterday, after the 2 of them had worked together to force Fan Xian and Xiao En off the cliff, the brocade guard had begun a secret search outside Shangjing. Unexpectedly, a day and a night had passed without any results. In the morning, when they finally couldn't resist asking for help from the palace to force their way into the diplomatic mission, they found Fan Xian sitting on the bed. Is it not Fan Xian? Friar He's pale face turned even paler. The poison on his thigh had been purged, but it had also cost him a lot of energy. Lang Tiao closed his eyes and said, That person must be Fan Xian. He is good at using poison and needles. Other than him, who else could it be? Friar He frowned. But that person looks different from Fan Xian. Lang Tiao opened his eyes and said, People can be disguised. Lang Tiao's status was special, so when he spoke, no one doubted him. But in reality, Fan Xian was perfectly fine in the diplomatic mission. If he had been the one who had fallen off the cliff, how could he have remained in one piece? Unless he was an immortal. Shen Zhong couldn't help but doubt Lang Tiao's judgment. But on the surface, he maintained the benevolent countenance of a wealthy old man. The most likely culprit is Fan Xian, because Shang Shanhu is colluding with a southerner. Only a southerner would know so much about this matter. It can't be one of the aces of Dongyi. Seeing Friar He shake his head in disagreement, Shinzhong chuckled. Of course, it could be someone else. Other than Fan Xian, who else could it be? Lang Tiao said in a low voice. He didn't like dealing with the heads of secret agents. If it weren't for the fact that Xiao En was involved, he wouldn't have left the palace to help the brocade guard. Shinzhong glanced at Lang Tiao. With a face full of smiles he said, Sir Lang Tiao, the Qing kingdom also has many aces. As for the problem of methods, I think you have heard that there has always been an assassin by Chen Pingping's side called the Shadow. However, no one has seen him, and no one knows his methods and style of doing things. Since Fan Xian is the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, then he must have some connection to the Shadow's methods. If that's the case, then the one who attacked the cliff was not Fan Xian, but the Shadow. The Shadow was Chen Pingping's bodyguard. Although no one had ever seen him, as the head of the Northern Qi secret agents, Shinzhong naturally knew of his existence. It doesn't matter who it was. Friar He sighed. The most important thing right now is to confirm whether or not Xiao En is dead. Xiao En is dead, Lang Tiao said calmly. When the black-clothed Fan Xian attacked to save Xiao En, Lang Tiao turned around and stabbed his curved knife into Xiao En's abdomen. He was very confident that the force of the knife's tip had cut off Xiao En's life in that instant. Shinzhong smiled. That's good. The Imperial Advisor and the Empress Dowager will be very satisfied. I thank you both. Once again, the sun was about to sink below the western city wall of Shangjing. Just like every day for thousands of years, the slightly hot wind swirled around the slightly withered leaves and crashed into the various houses in Shangjing. It swirled past people's bodies and swept past the silent tree trunks. After nightfall, the wind gradually cooled. Fan Xian wore an unlined robe and stood next to a tree in the rear courtyard of the diplomatic mission. His eyes narrowed as he watched the first star appear on the horizon. In this weather, he didn't need to wear an unlined robe, but his body was too tired, so he was a little afraid of the cold. He carefully folded the letter in his hand. He didn't use the strength of his palms to shatter it like he usually did. Because this letter was not a secret letter from the council. It was just an ordinary letter from home. The letter was written by Wan Er. Although news from home had been continuously spreading to the north, this was the first time Fan Xian had received a letter from his wife. Presumably, she had been waiting at home a little anxiously. His father-in-law, the Prime Minister, had already stepped down, and Debeo had already been brought to Fan Manor. Ruorua was as calm as usual, as if she hadn't been disturbed by the rumors of marriage. His father was busy with court affairs. These were all the contents of the letter. At the end of the letter, there was nothing about longing, nor was there any urging of a certain person's journey. There were only a few lines. The summer night wind has stopped, and I am troubled in my dreams. I know that you will not return, and my black hair grows longer. How long has it been since we parted? Thinking of you is like 3 days. Why have you come? To bury your head in your books. Thinking of you is like 3 days. Yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Fan Xian smiled. He could feel the faint longing in the letter, and the woman's rare relaxed mood. He felt a little comforted. These days, he had been busy with many conspiracies, and inevitably his longing for the woman at home had faded. Occasionally, when he thought of her, he felt a little guilty. He and Haitang had arranged to meet the day after tomorrow, and for some reason, he was now looking forward to this meeting. This was definitely not a problem between a man and a woman. It was just a very pure kind of hope. Fan Xian wanted to find someone to talk to. More accurately, after his conversation with Xiao En, he needed to talk. But there was no one to talk to. This strange and wonderful feeling lingered in his heart. On that rainy night in the capital of the Kingdom of Qing, after the chest had been opened, Fan Xian had thought that he would no longer be lonely in this world. After all, the smell and traces of that woman were everywhere in this world. But now he truly felt that he was still lonely, because that woman had already disappeared without a trace. Xiao En was right. I really am a heartless person, Fan Xian thought to himself. Fan Xian thought to himself that he was a man without friends. He shook his head and walked into the side room. There were only 3 people in the room. Fan Xian, Yan Bingyun, and Wang Qinian. This was the last internal meeting of the Overwatch Council in Shangjing. Yan Bingyun looked at Fan Xian calmly. Master Fan, have you gotten anything out of him? This was a situation that Fan Xian had already anticipated. He had used all the power of the Overwatch Council and Xinjiang to obtain such a clever death trap. As an official of the Kingdom of Qing, everyone was naturally eager to know what secret Xiaoen was talking about. He frowned. I acted too late. Xiaoen is dead. A strange look flashed through Yan Bingyun's eyes, but he immediately returned to normal. He shook his head and sighed. I've planned for so long, but nothing has come of it. What a pity. Fan Xian smiled mockingly. The old cripple has been working for 20 years and still hasn't gotten anything out of him. Do you think I'm an immortal? In his conversations with Yan Bingyun, he would purposely refer to Chen Pingping as an old cripple. This was a very impulsive, even clumsy threat. But when dealing with someone as intelligent as Yan Bingyun, this kind of impulsive method was often more effective. He turned his head to Wang Qinian. Prepare for the return journey. Yes, sir, replied Wang Qinian in a low voice. He paused for a moment, then frowned. Master, what do we do with the impostor who was left in the room yesterday? Fan Xian knew that he meant to silence him, and he felt a little uncomfortable. Bring him back, of course. Yan Bingyun shook his head in disapproval. What if the Northern Qi people find out? What if they find out? Fan Xian stared at Yan Bingyun's face and said mockingly. Of course, we'll do nothing. Even if they find out, what can they do? You've been locked up for a year, and your courage has shrunk. Yan Bingyun and Wang Qinian looked at each other. They realized that Fan Xian was in a bad mood today, and so they tacitly kept their mouths shut. Fan Xian looked at the two of them and suddenly sighed. Do you think Hai Tang can't tell? She just can't do anything to me. Wang Qinian then asked for instructions on the return journey. Fan Xian was silent for a moment, then slowly said, Once the Empress Dowager's birthday banquet is over, we'll leave immediately. I'm a little homesick. You're tuning in to the Xueqi's Martial Arts Saga YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.